A millionaire decides to pay a surprise visit to his stepmother's house, where his father has been living for the past 10 years. Upon entering, he finds his father kneeling on the floor, silently crying as he scrubs the floor. The millionaire is completely shocked to discover what was happening in that house. What he decides to do next is truly heartwarming. The sleek penthouse office on the 50th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper buzzed with activity. Phones rang incessantly, and the staccato of fingers on keyboards filled the air. At the center of this controlled chaos sat Alexander Thornton, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the computer screen before him. At 35, he was the epitome of success, CEO of Thornton Enterprises, a Fortune 500 company he had built from the ground up. Alexander leaned back in his ergonomic chair, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. The latest quarterly report showed record profits, and the board meeting earlier that day had gone better than expected. He was on top of the world, or so he thought. A soft knock on the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called out, his voice carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to giving orders. His assistant, Sarah, entered, a crisp white envelope in her hand. "This just arrived for you, Mr. Thornton. It's marked urgent and personal." Alexander's brow furrowed. In the digital age, personal letters were a rarity, especially ones marked urgent. He took the envelope from Sarah, dismissing her with a nod. As the door closed behind her, he examined the envelope. No return address, just his name and office address typed neatly on the front. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, he tore open the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief, typed in a plain font, but its contents sent a chill down his spine. "Your father needs you. Return to Oakwood Manor immediately. Time is running out." Alexander's heart raced as he read and reread the cryptic message. Oakwood Manor, the sprawling countryside estate where he had grown up, a place he hadn't set foot in for nearly a decade. And his father, Richard Thornton, a man he had barely spoken to since he left home at 18, determined to make his own way in the world. Memories flooded back, unbidden and unwelcome. The grand house with its manicured lawns and secret gardens, the echoing laughter of happier times. And then the arguments, the tension, the day he walked away, vowing never to return. His stepmother, Victoria, flashed in his mind, a woman who had entered their lives after his mother's passing, bringing with her a coldness that had slowly permeated the once warm halls of Oakwood Manor. He had never trusted her, never accepted her as family. Was she behind this mysterious letter? Alexander's fingers hovered over his phone, tempted to call his father and demand answers, but something held him back. The last time they spoke, nearly 2 years ago, the conversation had ended in bitter words and mutual silence. He stood up abruptly, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city he had conquered. New York stretched out before him, a testament to his ambition and drive. He had left Oakwood Manor behind, determined to prove himself, to build an empire that would eclipse his family's old money and outdated traditions. And he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Thornton Enterprises was his creation, his legacy. He had everything he had ever wanted: wealth, power, respect. So why did this simple letter make him feel like that uncertain 18-year-old boy again? "Time is running out," the letter had said. What did that mean? Was his father ill, in trouble? Or was this some elaborate ploy to lure him back? Alexander's mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He thought of his father, once a pillar of strength and wisdom in his life, now a stranger. Had he made a mistake in staying away so long? Had his pursuit of success come at too high a cost? The sun began to set, painting the New York skyline in hues of orange and purple. Alexander remained at the window, lost in thought, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. He had built his life on calculated risks and informed decisions, but now, faced with this cryptic message from his past, he felt adrift. As darkness fell over the city, Alexander made a decision. He couldn't ignore this. Whatever was happening at Oakwood Manor, he needed to face it head-on. He had run away once, he wouldn't do it again. With a deep breath, he turned back to his desk and pressed the intercom. "Sarah, Cancel all my appointments for the next week and book me on the next flight to Boston." "Of course, Mr. Thornton," Sarah replied, a note of surprise in her voice. "May I ask what's come up?" Alexander paused, his eyes falling on a framed photo on his desk, a much younger version of himself standing proudly next to his father in front of Oakwood Manor. It was the only personal item in his otherwise austere office. "Family business," he said finally. "I'm going home." As he began to pack up his things, a mix of emotions swirled within him: anxiety, curiosity, and a strange sense of inevitability. Whatever awaited him at Oakwood Manor, Alexander knew that his carefully constructed world was about to be shaken to its core. Little did he know that this journey home would not only force him to confront his past, but would also challenge everything he thought he knew about his family, success, and the true meaning of home. The taxi wound its way through the familiar countryside, each turn bringing Alexander closer to his past. The rolling hills of Massachusetts, once a source of comfort, now seemed to loom ominously. As Oakwood Manor came into view, its Georgian facade a stark silhouette against the overcast sky, Alexander felt a knot form in his stomach. "You can stop here," he told the driver, deciding to walk the last stretch of the long driveway. As the taxi pulled away, leaving him alone with his thoughts and a small overnight bag, Alexander took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. The grounds of Oakwood Manor were a far cry from the immaculate gardens he remembered. Overgrown hedges lined the driveway, and fallen leaves carpeted the once manicured lawn. It was as if the estate itself had fallen into a deep melancholy in his absence. As he approached the grand entrance, memories assaulted him. Summer afternoons spent reading under the old oak tree, now bare and gnarled. The window of his childhood bedroom, where he used to gaze out at the stars, dreaming of the future he would build. The bench where his mother used to sit, tending to her beloved roses, now withered and unkempt. Alexander hesitated at the front door, his hand poised to knock. The house seemed eerily quiet. No lights shone from within, no signs of life stirred behind the curtained windows. For a moment he considered turning back, returning to the safety and predictability of his life in New York, but the weight of the anonymous letter in his pocket anchored him to the spot. Taking a deep breath, he raised his hand to knock, only to find the door slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine as he gently pushed it open. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the vast foyer. "Dad? Victoria? Is anyone home?" Silence greeted him. The interior of Oakwood Manor was a shadow of its former glory. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight that filtered through the grimy windows. The once polished marble floor was scuffed and dirty. Family portraits hung crookedly on the walls, their subjects seeming to watch Alexander with accusing eyes. "What happened here?" Alexander muttered to himself, setting down his bag. The air was heavy with neglect and an underlying scent he couldn't quite place, a mixture of must and something more unpleasant. As he moved deeper into the house, a faint sound caught his attention. It was coming from the direction of the grand living room. Cautiously, he made his way toward it, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The scene that greeted him in the living room would be forever etched in his memory. In the center of the room, surrounded by scattered furniture and piles of old newspapers, knelt a figure. It took Alexander a moment to recognize the man as his father. Richard Thornton, once a proud and dignified man, was on his hands and knees, scrubbing the floor with a dirty rag. His thinning hair was unkempt, his clothes shabby and stained, but it was the quiet sobs that shook his father's frame that truly broke Alexander's heart. "Dad?" Alexander whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and something else. Was it fear? "Alexander?" he croaked, his voice hoarse as if from disuse. "What are you doing here?" Alexander rushed to his father's side, kneeling beside him on the filthy floor. "Dad, what's going on? What happened to you?" "To the house." Richard attempted to straighten up, wincing as he did so. "It's nothing, son. I'm just doing a bit of cleaning. You shouldn't have come all this way. Everything's fine." But everything was far from fine. Up close, Alexander could see the toll the years had taken on his father. Deep lines etched Richard's face, and his once strong hands trembled as he clutched the dirty rag. There was a defeated slump to his shoulders that Alexander had never seen before. "Dad, please," Alexander pleaded, gently taking the rag from his father's hands. "Talk to me. Where's Victoria? Why is the house in this state?" At the mention of Victoria's name, a shadow passed over Richard's face. He seemed to shrink into himself, his gaze darting nervously around the room as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Your stepmother. She's out for the day," Richard said haltingly. "She likes the house to be clean when she returns. I must have lost track of time." Alexander's mind reeled. This couldn't be the same confident, successful man who had raised him. What had happened in the years he'd been away to reduce his father to this state? "Dad," Alexander said firmly, helping Richard to his feet and guiding him to a nearby armchair, "I need you to tell me the truth. What's really going on here?" For a long moment, Richard was silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It's been difficult since you left, Alexander. Victoria, she's changed. Or maybe she was always this way, and I was too blind to see it." Alexander leaned in, his heart pounding. "What do you mean, Dad? Has she hurt you?" Richard's eyes filled with tears. "Not physically, no, but every day she reminds me of my failures, of how I drove you away. She says I'm useless, that this house is hers now, that I'm just a guest here on her charity." The words tumbled out now as if a dam had broken. Richard spoke of years of emotional abuse, of being slowly stripped of his dignity and self-worth, of Victoria's cutting remarks and manipulative behavior, of feeling trapped in his own home, with nowhere to turn. As Alexander listened, horror and guilt warred within him. How could he have left his father in this situation? How could he have been so wrapped up in his own ambitions that he failed to see what was happening? "Why didn't you tell me?" Alexander asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you reach out?" Richard looked up at him, a glimmer of his old strength shining through the pain in his eyes. "I was ashamed, son. I didn't want you to see me like this, and I thought you were better off without all this weighing you down. You were building your own life, your own success. I didn't want to burden you with my problems." Alexander felt a surge of determination. "You're not a burden, Dad. You're my father, and I'm going to make this right." Just then, the sound of a car pulling up outside broke the moment. Richard stiffened, panic flashing across his face. "She's back," he whispered. "Alexander, you should go. If Victoria finds you here." But Alexander stood up, squaring his shoulders. "No, Dad, I'm not going anywhere. It's time I had a talk with my stepmother." As the front door opened and the click of heels echoed through the foyer, Alexander prepared himself for the confrontation to come. He had walked away from his family once before. This time, he was determined to stand his ground and fight for the father who had always fought for him. Little did he know that this confrontation would be just the beginning of a journey that would test his resolve, challenge his beliefs, and ultimately lead him to rediscover the true meaning of family and home. The sound of heels clicking on marble echoed through the foyer, growing louder with each passing second. Alexander stood his ground, positioning himself between his father and the doorway. Richard, still seated in the armchair, seemed to shrink further into himself, his eyes fixed on the floor. Victoria Thornton swept into the room, her designer outfit a stark contrast to the neglected surroundings. She stopped short at the sight of Alexander, her perfectly manicured eyebrows arching in surprise. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Look who's decided to grace us with his presence after all these years. To what do we owe this pleasure, Alexander?" Alexander's jaw clenched as he took in the woman before him. Victoria had aged well, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless, but there was a hardness in her eyes that sent a chill down his spine. "Hello, Victoria," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I received a letter suggesting that my father needed me. Now that I'm here, I can see that the situation is even more concerning than I imagined." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "A letter? How interesting. And pray tell, what situation are you referring to?" Alexander gestured around the room. "Look at this place, Victoria. It's falling apart. And my father—" He trailed off, glancing back at Richard, who hadn't moved or looked up since Victoria entered. Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, I see. You waltz in here after years of absence and suddenly you're an expert on our living situation? Your father is fine, aren't you, Richard dear? Richard mumbled something inaudible, his shoulders hunched. Alexander felt his anger rising. He's not fine, this isn't fine. What have you been doing to him? Victoria's facade of politeness dropped, her voice turning cold. What have I been doing? I've been here, Alexander. I've been here every day for the past decade while you were off playing big shot in New York. Where were you when the business started failing? Where were you when your father needed support? That's not fair, Alexander retorted. I called. I tried to stay in touch, but every time I did, you were the one who answered. You were the one who said Dad was too busy to talk. Victoria scoffed. And you believed that? How convenient for you. It must have made it so much easier to focus on building your empire, knowing that Daddy was just too busy to talk to his only son. The words stung, but Alexander pushed past the guilt. Regardless of what happened in the past, I'm here now. And I'm not leaving until I understand what's going on and make sure my father is okay. Victoria's eyes flashed dangerously. You seem to be under the mistaken impression that you have any say in what happens in this house, Alexander. Let me remind you, this is my home. Your father is here by my grace. You have no power here. Your home? Alexander echoed, incredulous. This has been in my family for generations. How could it possibly be your home? A smirk played on Victoria's lips. Oh, there's so much you don't know, dear stepson. Your father signed over the deed to me years ago. Oakwood Manor belongs to me now, legally and irrevocably. Alexander turned to his father, shock evident on his face. Dad, is this true? Richard finally looked up, his eyes filled with shame. I had to, son. The business was failing. We were going to lose everything. Victoria. She said she could save it if I signed over the house. And I did save it, Victoria interjected. I kept this family from complete ruin while you were off chasing your dreams, Alexander. You don't get to come back now and play the hero. Alexander's mind raced. There had to be more to this story. His father would never have willingly given up Oakwood Manor. It had been in the Thornton family for 5 generations. This isn't right, he said, his voice low and determined. Whatever's going on here, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. And I'm not leaving my father in this situation. Victoria's face hardened. Your father is a grown man, Alexander. He made his choices. If you try to interfere, I promise you'll regret it. I have friends in high places, connections you couldn't begin to imagine. One word from me, and your precious company could come crashing down around your ears. The threat hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Alexander felt a flicker of fear, not for himself but for everything he had built. Could Victoria really have that kind of power? But then he looked at his father, still hunched in the chair, a shadow of the man he once was. In that moment, Alexander knew that no threat, no potential loss could make him abandon his father again. Do your worst, Victoria, he said, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. Victoria's eyes narrowed to slits. You always were a stubborn boy. Very well. If that's how you want to play it, so be it, but remember, I warned you. She turned on her heel, pausing at the doorway. Oh, and Richard, don't forget to finish cleaning the study. I expect it spotless by dinner. With that, she was gone, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Alexander immediately went to his father's side, kneeling beside the chair. Dad, why didn't you tell me things had gotten this bad? I could have helped. Richard shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. I was ashamed, son. I thought I could handle it. I never wanted you to see me like this. Alexander took his father's hands in his own, shocked at how frail they felt. Listen to me, Dad. We're going to fix this. I don't care what Victoria says. This is still our home, and you're still my father. I'm not leaving you here like this. For the first time since Alexander arrived, a glimmer of hope appeared in Richard's eyes. You mean that? I do, Alexander affirmed. Pack a bag. You're coming to stay with me in New York while we figure this out. As Richard slowly stood, years seeming to fall away from him at the prospect of escape, Alexander's mind was already racing. He needed to understand exactly what had happened with the business, with the house. He needed to know how Victoria had gained so much power and what connections she was threatening to use against him. But most of all, he needed to make things right. He had walked away once, driven by ambition and a desire to prove himself. This time, he would stand and fight for his father, for his family legacy, and for the home that held so many memories. As they made their way upstairs to pack, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Victoria's threats echoed in his mind, and he knew she wouldn't let them go without a fight. What he didn't know was just how far she would go to keep her grip on Oakwood Manor, or the shocking revelations that awaited him as he dug deeper into his family's past. The battle for Oakwood Manor was about to begin, and it would test Alexander in ways he never imagined. The drive back to New York was tense and quiet. Richard sat in the passenger seat of Alexander's rental car, his small suitcase nestled in the back. He stared out the window, watching the familiar landscapes of his home fade away, replaced by the bustling highways leading to the city. Alexander glanced at his father periodically, concern etched on his face. The man beside him seemed so different from the strong, confident father he remembered. Years of emotional abuse had taken their toll, leaving Richard a shell of his former self. As they entered the outskirts of New York City, Richard finally broke the silence. "I never thought I'd leave Oakwood Manor," he said softly. "It's been in our family for so long. Your great-great-grandfather built it with his own hands." Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of family history pressing down on him. "We'll get it back, Dad, I promise. But first we need to understand exactly what happened. Can you tell me more about how things went wrong with the business?" Richard sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. "It started about a year after you left for college. The recession hit us hard. Orders dried up, and we were struggling to keep the factory open. I made some bad investments trying to keep things afloat." As they navigated through the city traffic, Richard's story unfolded. He spoke of mounting debts, of sleepless nights spent poring over account books. Of the day he realized he might lose not just the business, but Oakwood Manor as well. "That's when Victoria came to me with a proposal," Richard continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said she had connections, people who could help save the business. All I had to do was sign over the house to her." Alexander's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "And you agreed, just like that?" Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know what else to do, son. I thought I was protecting our legacy, protecting your future. I never imagined it would turn out like this." As they pulled into the underground parking of Alexander's building, a sleek high-rise in the heart of Manhattan, Richard fell silent once more. The contrast between the gleaming modernity of Alexander's world and the faded grandeur of Oakwood Manor couldn't have been starker. In the elevator ride up to the penthouse, Alexander's mind raced. There had to be more to this story. Victoria's threats, her supposed connections, none of it added up. He needed answers, and he knew just where to start looking. The doors opened directly into Alexander's apartment, a spacious, minimalist space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Richard stepped out hesitantly, looking around with a mixture of awe and discomfort. "Make yourself at home, Dad," Alexander said, guiding him to the guest room. "Why don't you get some rest? I need to make a few calls." Once Richard was settled, Alexander retreated to his home office. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for: Marcus Green, his childhood friend who had gone on to become a successful private investigator. "Marcus, it's Alex Thornton. I need your help with something urgent. It's about my family." An hour later, Alexander emerged from his office, his face grim. The conversation with Marcus had been enlightening, to say the least. Victoria's past was not as clean as she'd like everyone to believe. He found Richard in the living room, standing by the window, gazing out at the city below. "Beautiful view," Richard murmured as Alexander approached. "You've done well for yourself, son." Alexander stood beside his father, following his gaze. "Thanks, Dad, but none of this means anything if I can't help you." Richard turned to him, a question in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Taking a deep breath, Alexander led his father to the couch. "I just got off the phone with Marcus Green. Remember him? He's a PI now. I asked him to do some digging into Victoria's background." Richard's eyes widened. And? And it turns out our dear stepmother isn't who she claims to be, Alexander said, his voice hard. Her real name is Vanessa Blackwood. She's been involved in multiple fraud cases over the years, always managing to slip away before charges could be filed. Richard sank back into the couch, shock written across his face. That can't be right. We've been married for 15 years. Surely I would have known. Alexander shook his head. She's good at what she does, Dad. Really good. Marcus found a pattern. She targets wealthy families going through hard times, worms her way in, and then slowly takes control of their assets. As the implications of this revelation sank in, Richard's face crumpled. Oh God, what have I done? I handed her everything. Our home, our legacy. Alexander placed a comforting hand on his father's shoulder. It's not your fault, Dad. You were vulnerable and she took advantage of that. But now that we know the truth, we can fight back. Richard looked up, a glimmer of his old determination returning to his eyes. How? She has all the legal documents. The house is in her name. A small smile played on Alexander's lips. True, but fraud voids any contract. If we can prove that Victoria, or Vanessa, misrepresented herself, we might be able to nullify the transfer of the house. For the first time since leaving Oakwood Manor, hope bloomed in Richard's eyes. You really think we can do that? Alexander nodded, his resolve strengthening. I do. It won't be easy, and Victoria won't go down without a fight. But we're Thorntons, Dad. We don't give up. As they sat there, father and son reunited in purpose, Alexander felt a shift in the air. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with legal battles and potentially dangerous confrontations. Victoria's threat still loomed large, and Alexander knew she would make good on them if pushed. But looking at his father, seeing the spark of life returning to his eyes, Alexander knew it was worth any risk. Oakwood Manor wasn't just a house. It was their history, their legacy, and he would fight with everything he had to reclaim it. What Alexander didn't yet realize was that Victoria's deception ran even deeper than they imagined. As they prepared to take their first steps in the battle for Oakwood Manor, unseen forces were already moving against them. The true test of their resolve, and their bond as father and son, was yet to come. The next morning dawned bright and clear over Manhattan, but inside Alexander's penthouse, a storm was brewing. The living room had been transformed into a makeshift war room, with papers, folders, and laptops strewn across every available surface. Alexander sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by stacks of documents. He had been up most of the night, poring over old financial records, property deeds, and business contracts. Across from him, Richard nursed a cup of coffee, his brow furrowed in concentration as he scrolled through years of email correspondence on a laptop. I still can't believe I didn't see it, Richard murmured, shaking his head. All these years and I never suspected. Alexander looked up from the pile of papers he was sorting. Don't beat yourself up, Dad. Victoria, Vanessa, whatever her name is, she's a professional. She knew exactly what she was doing. Just then, Alexander's phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. Got something. Meet me at Joe's Diner in an hour. That was Marcus, Alexander said, standing up and stretching. He wants to meet. Why don't you keep going through those emails? Look for anything unusual, especially around the time Victoria proposed the house transfer. Richard nodded, a determined look in his eyes. I'm on it, son. An hour later, Alexander slid into a booth at Joe's Diner, a nondescript eatery tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Marcus Green sat opposite him, a thick manila folder on the table between them. Thanks for meeting me, Alex, Marcus said, his voice low. What I found, well, it's bigger than we thought. Alexander leaned forward, his heart racing. What do you mean? Marcus opened the folder, spreading out several documents. Victoria, or Vanessa, isn't working alone. She's part of a larger operation. They target wealthy families, especially those with valuable properties or businesses that are struggling. Alexander's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. There were photos of Victoria, with different hair colors and styles, newspaper clippings detailing fraud investigations that mysteriously went cold, and complex diagrams showing connections between various shell companies. But here's where it gets really interesting, Marcus continued, pulling out a particular photo. Recognize this guy? Alexander felt his blood run cold. The man in the photo, standing next to Victoria at some high society event, was none other than his uncle, Robert Thornton. That's my Uncle Robert, Alexander stammered. Dad's younger brother. But how? Marcus's expression was grim. From what I've pieced together, your uncle has been working with this group for years. He was the one who introduced Victoria to your father. Alexander sat back, his mind reeling. Uncle Robert had always been the black sheep of the family, constantly in and out of failed business ventures. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. Does my father know about this? Alexander asked. Marcus shook his head. I don't think so. It seems Robert has been careful to keep his distance publicly, but he's been pulling strings behind the scenes. As Marcus continued to lay out his findings, a clearer picture began to emerge. The scheme was elaborate and long-running. Victoria's marriage to Richard wasn't just about getting control of Oakwood Manor. It was part of a larger plan to systematically strip the Thornton family of all its assets. But why? Alexander muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. Why would Uncle Robert do this to his own family? Marcus shrugged. Money, power, revenge, could be any number of reasons. But here's the kicker, Alex. I think they're planning to sell Oakwood Manor. Alexander's head snapped up. What? To whom? There's a development company that's been buying up old estates in the area. They're planning some kind of luxury resort. The land Oakwood Manor sits on would be the final piece they need. Alexander felt a surge of anger. Not only had Victoria manipulated and abused his father, but now she planned to sell off their family legacy to developers. He wouldn't let that happen. What can we do? He asked Marcus. Well, that's the tricky part, Marcus replied. Legally, Victoria owns the property. Even with what we know about her true identity, it would be a long, messy court battle to try and void the transfer. Alexander's mind raced. There had to be a way to stop this. What if we could prove that Uncle Robert was involved from the beginning? That this whole thing was a conspiracy to defraud my father? Marcus nodded slowly. That could work, but we'd need solid evidence. Something that directly links Robert to Victoria and this fraud operation. Just then, Alexander's phone buzzed. It was a text from his father. Found something. You need to see this. I've got to go, Alexander said, standing up. Dad might have found something important. Can you keep digging, especially into Uncle Robert's involvement? Marcus gathered up the documents, nodding. You got it, Alex. Be careful, though. These people, they're dangerous. If they realize we're onto them, there's no telling what they might do. As Alexander hurried back to his apartment, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at Victoria and Uncle Robert for their betrayal. Fear for his father's safety. Determination to set things right. But beneath it all was a growing sense of urgency. The stakes were higher than he'd realized. This wasn't just about reclaiming Oakwood Manor anymore. It was about exposing a criminal operation and protecting other families from falling victim to the same scheme. As he stepped into the elevator of his building, Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever his father had discovered. The battle for Oakwood Manor was entering a new phase, and he knew that the next few days would be crucial. What he didn't know was that back at the diner, someone had been watching his meeting with Marcus. As Alexander rode up to his penthouse, a figure in a nondescript car outside his building picked up a phone. They know, the figure said simply. How do you want to handle this, Ms. Blackwood? On the other end of the line, Victoria's voice was cold and calculating. Keep watching them. We may need to accelerate our plans and find out what that old fool Richard has discovered. We can't afford any loose ends. As the call ended, the true depth of the conspiracy began to unfold. Alexander and Richard were about to find themselves in a dangerous game of cat and mouse with Oakwood Manor, and perhaps their very lives hanging in the balance. Alexander burst into his apartment, his heart pounding with anticipation. "Dad!" he called out, scanning the room for his father. Richard emerged from the study, a stack of papers clutched in his trembling hands. "Alexander, thank God you're back. You need to see this." Father and son settled on the couch, and Richard spread the documents on the coffee table. "I was going through old emails like you suggested," he began, his voice shaky, "and I found these buried in a folder I'd forgotten about." Alexander leaned forward, his eyes scanning the papers. They were emails dating back to just before Victoria had entered their lives, but they weren't from Victoria. They were from Uncle Robert. "I'd completely forgotten about these," Richard said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Robert reached out to me when the business started struggling. He said he had a friend who might be able to help, an investment expert named Vanessa Blackwood." Alexander's jaw clenched. "Victoria." Richard nodded, his face pale. "There's more. Look at this email from a few months later." Alexander picked up the indicated paper, his eyes widening as he read. In the email, Robert was pushing Richard to consider selling Oakwood Manor, citing its high maintenance costs. He even suggested a potential buyer, a development company called Evergreen Resorts. "That's the company Marcus mentioned," Alexander muttered. He looked up at his father, seeing the pain and betrayal etched on his face. "Dad, I'm so sorry. Uncle Robert. He's been working with Victoria this whole time." Richard slumped back, looking suddenly old and frail. "My own brother," he whispered. "How could he do this to us?" Alexander put a comforting hand on his father's shoulder. "I don't know, Dad, but we're going to find out and we're going to stop them." Just then, Alexander's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Central Park, Bethesda Fountain, 1 hour. Come alone. R." Alexander stared at the message, his mind racing. Could it be Uncle Robert? And if so, why now? "What is it, son?" Richard asked, noticing Alexander's furrowed brow. Alexander hesitated for a moment, then showed his father the message. "I think it's from Uncle Robert. He wants to meet." Richard's eyes widened in alarm. "Alexander, no. It could be a trap. We should call the police, show them what we've found." But Alexander shook his head. "We don't have enough concrete evidence yet, Dad. The police won't be able to do anything. But if I can get Uncle Robert to talk, to admit his involvement, that could change everything." Richard looked unconvinced, but Alexander pressed on. "I'll be careful, I promise, and I'll have Marcus watching from a distance, just in case." After a tense discussion, Richard reluctantly agreed. As Alexander prepared to leave, he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. He was walking into unknown territory, potentially facing off against people who had spent years orchestrating this elaborate scheme. An hour later, Alexander approached Bethesda Fountain, his senses on high alert. The bustling park seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding within it. Tourists snapped photos, children laughed and played, while Alexander's world teetered on the brink of chaos. He spotted Uncle Robert before the older man saw him. Robert Thornton had aged since Alexander last saw him, his once dark hair now streaked with grey. He sat on a bench, nervously glancing around, his fingers drumming an erratic rhythm on his knee. "Uncle Robert," Alexander said as he approached, causing the older man to start. "Alexander," Robert replied, his voice a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Alexander sat down beside his uncle, maintaining a careful distance. "Why did you want to meet Uncle Robert? Why now?" Robert's shoulders slumped. For a moment, he looked every bit as defeated as Richard had earlier. "Because it's gone too far, Alex. This whole thing, it wasn't supposed to be like this." "Like what?" Alexander pressed. "You mean the scheme to defraud my father and steal our family home?" Robert flinched at the accusation, but didn't deny it. "You have to understand, Alex. I was desperate. My businesses had failed. I was drowning in debt. When Victoria approached me with her plan, it seemed like a way out." Alexander felt a surge of anger. "A way out? By betraying your own family?" "It wasn't supposed to hurt Richard," Robert insisted, his eyes pleading. "Victoria promised she would help save the business, that your father would be taken care of. I thought I was helping." Alexander scoffed. "Helping? Uncle Robert, have you seen what this has done to Dad? Victoria has been emotionally abusing him for years. She's stripped him of everything. His confidence, his self-worth, nearly his sanity." Robert's face crumpled. "I didn't know, Alex. I swear I didn't know it had gotten that bad. I've been kept out of the loop for years now, but recently I heard rumors. whispers about what Victoria's really planning. Alexander leaned forward, his heart racing. What is she planning, Uncle Robert? Robert looked around nervously before continuing. The sale to Evergreen Resort, it's not just about Oakwood Manor. Victoria and her associates have been acquiring properties all over the county. They're planning some kind of massive development. A resort, yes, but also a casino. Alexander's mind reeled. A casino would change the entire character of the area, not to mention the potential legal and ethical implications. But that's illegal in this county, he said. Robert nodded. That's why they needed someone with political connections, someone who could help change the zoning laws, grease the right palms. That's where I came in. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Alexander felt a mix of disgust and pity for his uncle. So what changed? Why are you telling me this now? Robert's eyes filled with tears. Because I saw your father last week, Alex. I stopped by Oakwood Manor, and I hardly recognized him. He looked so broken, so lost. It hit me then what I'd been part of, what I'd done to my own brother. Alexander studied his uncle's face, searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was genuine remorse and fear. What do you want from me, Uncle Robert? Help, Robert said simply. Help me make this right. I'll testify, tell the authorities everything I know. But Victoria... She's dangerous, Alex. More dangerous than you know. I can't do this alone. As Alexander considered his uncle's words, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Across the fountain, partially hidden behind a tree, was a familiar figure, Victoria's driver, the same man who had been watching his meeting with Marcus. In that moment, Alexander realized the true gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about reclaiming Oakwood Manor anymore. They were up against a sophisticated criminal organization, one with tentacles reaching into politics and law enforcement. Okay, Uncle Robert, Alexander said, standing up. I'll help you. But we need to move fast. I think we're being watched. As they hurried out of the park, Alexander's mind raced. He needed to get his uncle somewhere safe, somewhere they could talk freely. But more than that, he needed to protect his father. If Victoria realized that Robert was turning against her, there was no telling what she might do. The battle for Oakwood Manor had just become a race against time. With each passing moment, the stakes grew higher and the danger more real. Alexander knew that the next few days would determine not just the fate of his family home, but potentially the future of his entire family. What he didn't know was that Victoria was already several steps ahead of them. As Alexander and Robert left the park, a plan was being set in motion. A plan that would test the limits of Alexander's resolve and force him to confront the true meaning of family, loyalty, and sacrifice. Dawn broke over New York City, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. But inside the small Brooklyn apartment serving as their safe house, the Thornton men had barely slept. The dining table was covered in papers, laptops, and empty coffee cups, evidence of their night-long strategy session. Alexander stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in hushed tones with Marcus. Richard and Robert sat at the table, poring over documents and piecing together the complex web of Victoria's scheme. All right. Thanks, Marcus, Alexander said, ending the call. He turned to face his father and uncle, his expression a mix of determination and concern. Marcus has compiled all the evidence we have. He's ready to take it to the authorities, but we need to move fast. Victoria's people are already starting to cover their tracks. Richard looked up from the papers, a fire in his eyes that Alexander hadn't seen in years. Then let's do it. Let's bring her down. Robert, however, seemed hesitant. It's not that simple, he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Victoria has people everywhere. In the local police, the county clerk's office, even the state attorney general's office. If we go to the wrong person, this whole thing could backfire. Alexander nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. That's why we're not going to the locals. Marcus has a contact in the FBI, someone we can trust. But before we do that, there's something else we need to consider. He sat down at the table, looking at his father intently. Dad, even if we manage to expose Victoria and her organization, there's still the matter of Oakwood Manor. Legally, it's in her name. We need to find a way to invalidate that transfer." Richard's face fell, the weight of his past decisions clearly weighing on him. "But how? I signed those papers willingly. I was a fool, but I wasn't coerced." It was Robert who spoke up, surprising both Alexander and Richard. "Actually, there might be a way," he said, a hint of hope in his voice. "When Victoria first approached me about this plan, she mentioned something about the original deed to Oakwood Manor. Something about a clause that had been added by your great-grandfather, Richard." Richard's brow furrowed in concentration. "I vaguely remember something like that. Father mentioned it once, said it was some kind of safeguard, but I never paid much attention." Alexander leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What kind of clause?" Robert shook his head. "I'm not sure of the details. Victoria was always very secretive about it, but I got the impression it was something that could potentially invalidate any transfer of ownership outside the direct Thornton bloodline." A spark of hope ignited in Alexander's chest. If such a clause existed, it could be the key to reclaiming Oakwood Manor, regardless of the papers his father had signed. "Shall we need to find that original deed?" Alexander said, his mind racing. "It would likely be stored in the county records office, but with Victoria's connections, getting access could be tricky." Richard straightened in his chair, a determined look on his face. "I might know another way. In the library at Oakwood Manor, there's a hidden compartment behind one of the bookshelves. Father showed it to me years ago. He said it contained important family documents. The deed might be there." Alexander's eyes widened. "Dad, that's brilliant, but Oakwood Manor is crawling with Victoria's people now. How do we get in?" A sly smile spread across Richard's face, years seeming to fall away as a glimmer of his old self shone through. "I may have been pushed aside in my own home, but I still know every nook and cranny of that place. There's an old servant's entrance that leads directly to the library. It hasn't been used in decades. Victoria wouldn't know about it." For the first time since this ordeal began, Alexander felt a genuine sense of hope. They had a plan, they had evidence, and now they potentially had a legal way to reclaim their family home. "All right," Alexander said, standing up with renewed energy. "Here's what we're going to do. Dad, you and I will go to Oakwood Manor and find that deed. Uncle Robert, you'll stay here with Marcus. Go over every detail of Victoria's operation. We need to make sure our case is airtight when we take it to the FBI." Robert nodded, guilt and determination warring in his eyes. "I'll tell them everything. It's time I made things right." As Alexander and Richard prepared to leave, Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. His blood ran cold as he read the message. "I know what you're planning. Meet me at the Oakwood Bridge in 1 hour. Come alone, or your father pays the price. V." Alexander stared at the phone, his mind racing. Should he tell his father? Go to the meeting? Ignore it entirely? The threat to his father was clear, but it could also be a trap. In that moment, Alexander realized that this wasn't just about reclaiming a house or exposing a criminal enterprise. It was about family, about righting wrongs and standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. He looked at his father, seeing the hope and determination in the older man's eyes. Richard had suffered so much, had lost so much. Alexander couldn't bear the thought of putting him in danger again. Making a split-second decision, Alexander pocketed his phone without saying a word about the text. "Dad, there's been a slight change of plan. I need you to go with Uncle Robert to meet Marcus. There's something I have to do alone." Richard looked confused but nodded slowly. "All right, son, if you think that's best. But be careful. Victoria and her people, they're dangerous." Alexander hugged his father tightly, trying to convey all the love and regret and determination he felt in that embrace. "I will, Dad, I promise." As Alexander left the apartment, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions and strategies. He was walking into what was almost certainly a trap, but he couldn't see any other way. Whatever Victoria had planned, he would face it. For his father, for Oakwood Manor, for the future of his family. What Alexander didn't know was that Victoria's text wasn't the only unexpected development. Back at Oakwood Manor, in the hidden compartment in the library, a discovery had been made, one that would change everything. The original deed to Oakwood Manor had indeed been found, but its contents were far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. As Alexander made his way to Oakwood Bridge, The final pieces of this complex puzzle were about to fall into place. The fate of Oakwood Manor and the Thornton family itself hung in the balance, and the revelations to come would test Alexander's resolve in ways he never thought possible. The old Oakwood Bridge loomed before Alexander, its weathered wooden planks creaking softly in the early morning breeze. Mist clung to the river below, giving the scene an eerie, dreamlike quality. Alexander's footsteps echoed hollowly as he made his way to the center of the bridge, his senses on high alert. He checked his watch, 5:58 a.m. Victoria's message had said 1 hour, and Alexander was nothing if not punctual, even in the face of potential danger. As he reached the midpoint of the bridge, a figure emerged from the mist at the opposite end. Victoria Thornton, or rather Vanessa Blackwood, walked towards him with the confident stride of a predator. Her designer suit and perfectly coiffed hair seemed at odds with the rustic surroundings, but her sharp eyes and cruel smile were right at home in this tense confrontation. "Alexander," she purred as she drew near. "How good of you to come, and alone as instructed. You always were the obedient one, weren't you?" Alexander's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice level. "I'm here, Victoria. What do you want?" Victoria's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Straight to business, then." "Very well. I want you to call off your little investigation. Tell your PI friend to destroy all the evidence he's gathered. And most importantly, I want you and your father out of my hair for good." "And why would I do any of that?" Alexander asked, his voice hard. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. "Because, my dear stepson, I have something you want, something that could change everything." She opened the envelope and pulled out a weathered document. Even from a distance, Alexander recognized it as the original deed to Oakwood Manor. "You were right about the hidden compartment in the library," Victoria said, a note of admiration in her voice. "I must say I'm impressed, but you're too late. I've already found what you were looking for." Alexander's mind raced. If Victoria had the deed, did that mean the clause Robert had mentioned, the one that could invalidate her ownership, didn't exist? As if reading his thoughts, Victoria continued, "Oh, the clause is real. Your great-grandfather was quite the forward thinker, but it's not quite what you imagined." She held up the deed, her finger pointing to a specific paragraph. "It states that ownership of Oakwood Manor can indeed only pass to a direct descendant of the Thornton bloodline. But here's the interesting part. It also says that if no suitable heir exists, the property passes to the state to be preserved as a historical site." Alexander's brow furrowed. "But that doesn't change anything. I'm a direct descendant. The property should rightfully be mine or my father's." Victoria's laugh was cold and sharp. But that's where you're wrong, Alexander. You see, there's something your father never told you, something he himself might not even know." She paused, clearly savoring the moment. "You're not Richard Thornton's biological son." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his mind reeling. "You're lying," he managed to say, but even as the words left his mouth, a seed of doubt took root in his heart. Victoria shook her head, her expression a mockery of sympathy. "I'm afraid not. Your mother had an affair years ago. Richard isn't your real father. Which means, my dear Alexander, that you have no claim to Oakwood Manor. And with Richard being, well, let's say unsuitable in his current state, there is no heir. The property will go to the state, where my connections will ensure it falls into the right hands. Mine." Alexander's world was crumbling around him. Could it be true? Had his entire life been built on a lie? But even as doubt and confusion threatened to overwhelm him, a part of him remained clear-headed, analytical. "Even if what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "it doesn't change the fact that you obtained the property through fraud. Your claim wouldn't stand up in court." Victoria's smile turned predatory. "Perhaps, but are you willing to risk it? To drag your family's name through the mud? To force your father to relive his wife's betrayal in public? And all for what? A house you have no real connection to?" She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Walk away, Alexander. Take your father and disappear. I'll make sure you're both very comfortable. You can start a new life, free from all the unpleasantness." For a moment, Alexander was tempted. The idea of simply walking away, of leaving behind all the pain and betrayal, was seductive. But then he thought of his father, the man who had raised him, who had loved him unconditionally. Biology didn't make a father. Love and sacrifice did. "No," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength. "I don't believe you. And even if it were true, it changes nothing. Oakwood Manor belongs to my family. The family that built it, that lived in it, that loved it. I won't let you destroy that legacy." Victoria's face hardened, all pretense of civility dropping away. "You're making a mistake, Alexander. I tried to be reasonable, but you leave me no choice. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you had taken my offer." She turned to leave, but Alexander called out, "Wait, the deed, give it to me." Victoria laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "Oh, Alexander, you really think I'd give up my trump card so easily? No, I think I'll hold on to this. Consider it insurance." As Victoria disappeared into the mist, Alexander stood rooted to the spot, his mind a whirlwind of emotions and half-formed plans. The revelation about his parentage, true or not, had shaken him to his core, but it had also crystallized something in his mind. Family wasn't about blood. It was about love, about standing together in the face of adversity. And right now, his family needed him. With renewed determination, Alexander turned and strode off the bridge. He had a lot to process, but there was no time for self-doubt. Victoria had shown her hand, and now it was time for Alexander to play his. As he made his way back to the safe house, Alexander's mind was already formulating a new plan. Victoria thought she had won, that she had broken him with her revelation, but she had underestimated the strength of the bonds that held the Thornton family together. The final battle for Oakwood Manor was about to begin, and Alexander was more determined than ever to see it through to the end. Whatever the truth of his parentage, he was a Thornton in all the ways that mattered. And Thorntons didn't give up without a fight. The safe house was a flurry of activity when Alexander returned. Marcus had arrived with a mountain of documents and a grim expression. Richard and Robert were huddled over laptops, their faces etched with concern. But all activity ceased the moment Alexander walked through the door. "Son!" Richard exclaimed, relief evident in his voice. "Where have you been? We were worried sick." Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "I met with Victoria," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. A hush fell over the room. It was Marcus who broke the silence. "What happened? What did she want?" Alexander moved to the center of the room, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze upon him. She had the deed to Oakwood Manor. She found it in the hidden compartment in the library. Robert's face fell. "Then, the clause, the one that could invalidate her ownership?" "It exists," Alexander confirmed, "but it's not quite what we thought. It states that ownership can only pass to a direct descendant of the Thornton bloodline. If no suitable heir exists, the property goes to the state." Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. "But that's good news, isn't it? You're my son, my heir. The property should rightfully be ours." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his courage. When he opened them, he looked directly at his father. "Dad, there's something we need to talk about. Something Victoria told me about my parentage." The color drained from Richard's face. "Alex, what are you saying?" Gently, Alexander recounted Victoria's claim that he wasn't Richard's biological son, that his mother had had an affair years ago. As he spoke, he watched his father's face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition or confirmation. What he saw instead was a mixture of shock, confusion, and then understanding. "Oh, Margaret," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You never told him." Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. "Dad, you knew?" Richard nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes. "I've known since the day you were born, son. Your mother, she told me everything just before she went into labor. She was so afraid, so full of guilt. But the moment I saw you, held you in my arms, none of it mattered. You were my son, biology be damned." The room was silent as Alexander processed this information. It was true then. The man he had called father all his life, the man he had modeled himself after, wasn't his biological parent. And yet, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard stood, crossing the room to stand before his son. "Because it didn't matter, Alex, not to me. You were my son in every way that counted. I was afraid that if you knew, it might change how you felt about me, about our family." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. All the anger, all the resentment he had harbored over the years, for his father's perceived weakness, for the distance that had grown between them, seemed to melt away in that moment. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking, "it wouldn't have changed anything. You raised me, you loved me. You're my father no matter what biology says." The two men embraced, years of unspoken emotions pouring out in that simple gesture. When they finally parted, both had tears in their eyes. It was Marcus who brought them back to the matter at hand. "I hate to interrupt," he said gently, "but we need to discuss what this means for our case." Alexander nodded, wiping his eyes and turning to face the room. "Victoria thinks she's won. She believes that with no suitable heir she can manipulate things to gain control of Oakwood Manor through the state." Robert spoke up, his voice hesitant. "But if you're not a direct descendant and with Richard's current state, doesn't that mean she's right?" Alexander felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's what she thinks. But she's overlooked something crucial." He turned to his father. "Dad, do you remember exactly how the clause in the deed is worded? Does it specifically say biological descendant?" Richard's eyes widened as understanding dawned. No, it doesn't. It just says direct descendant of the Thornton bloodline." Alexander nodded, excitement building in his voice. "Exactly. And legally, I am your son. My birth certificate lists you as my father. I've been raised as a Thornton my entire life. In the eyes of the law, I am a direct descendant of the Thornton bloodline." Marcus let out a low whistle. "That's brilliant, Alex. It's a loophole, but it's a strong one. Any good lawyer could make that case stick." "But it's more than that," Alexander continued. "Victoria's entire claim is based on fraud. Even if we couldn't prove my right to inheritance, we have enough evidence to invalidate her ownership entirely." The room buzzed with renewed energy as the implications sank in. They had a chance, a real chance to reclaim Oakwood Manor and bring Victoria's criminal enterprise crumbling down. As the group began to plan their next moves, Alexander felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find his uncle Robert standing there, an unreadable expression on his face. "Alex," Robert said softly, I owe you an apology. To all of you. What I did, getting involved with Victoria, betraying my own family, it's unforgivable." Alexander studied his uncle's face, seeing genuine remorse in the older man's eyes. "You made a mistake, Uncle Robert, a big one, but you're here now trying to make it right. That counts for something." Robert shook his head. "It's not enough, but I want you to know, while I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions, whatever it takes to bring Victoria down and restore Oakwood Manor to our family, I'll do it." Alexander felt a surge of respect for his uncle. It took courage to admit one's mistakes, to face the music. "Thank you, Uncle Robert. We're going to need all the help we can get." As the Thornton men, father, son, and uncle, stood together, united in purpose, Alexander felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced in years. They had weathered betrayals, uncovered painful truths, and faced seemingly insurmountable odds. But they had done it together, as a family. The road ahead would not be easy. Victoria and her organization would not go down without a fight. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Alexander truly believed they could win. Oakwood Manor wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of their family's resilience, of the bonds that held them together through good times and bad. And they would fight with everything they had to reclaim it. As the sun rose over New York City, casting a golden glow through the safe house windows, the Thorntons prepared for the battle of their lives. Little did they know that Victoria had one last card to play, a desperate gambit that would put everything they held dear at risk. The final confrontation was approaching, and the fate of Oakwood Manor hung in the balance. But with truth on their side and the strength of their family bond, the Thorntons were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The next 48 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. The safe house had been transformed into a makeshift war room, with maps, documents, and laptops covering every available surface. Alexander, Richard, Robert, and Marcus worked tirelessly, piecing together the final elements of their case against Victoria and her organization. As the sun rose on the morning of their planned move against Victoria, Alexander stood by the window, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the city come to life. The weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on his shoulders. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked, coming to stand beside him. Alexander nodded, his jaw set with determination. "As ready as we'll ever be. Did you get in touch with your FBI contact?" Marcus grinned, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "Better than that. I spoke directly with the head of the White-Collar Crimes Division. They're very interested in what we have to say. We've got a meeting set up for this afternoon." A spark of hope ignited in Alexander's chest. This was it, their chance to bring Victoria down and reclaim Oakwood Manor once and for all. As the group made their final preparations, Alexander's phone buzzed with an incoming text. His blood ran cold as he read the message. "I warned you, Alexander. Now you'll see what happens when you cross me. Turn on the news. Evaki." With shaking hands, Alexander grabbed the remote and turned on the small TV in the corner of the room. The others gathered around, sensing the sudden tension. The screen flickered to life, showing a live news broadcast. The headline at the bottom of the screen made Alexander's heart skip a beat. Breaking: prominent CEO Alexander Thornton, accused of fraud and embezzlement. The room fell silent as the news anchor's voice filled the air. In a shocking turn of events, Alexander Thornton, CEO of Thornton Enterprises, has been accused of orchestrating a massive fraud scheme. Anonymous sources claim that Thornton has been embezzling funds and manipulating company records for years. The SEC has announced a full investigation, and Thornton Enterprises stock has plummeted in early trading. Alexander felt the room spin around him. This was Victoria's revenge, a calculated strike aimed at destroying everything he had built. "It's not true," he whispered, more to himself than to the others. "None of it's true." Richard placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. "We know that, Alex, and we'll prove it. But right now we need to focus on the bigger picture." Marcus was already on his phone, his voice urgent. "I'm calling my FBI contact. We need to move our meeting up, now." As Marcus stepped away to make the call, Robert approached Alexander, his face etched with guilt. "This is my fault," he said softly. "I should have known Victoria would do something like this. I'm so sorry, Alex." Alexander shook his head, forcing himself to think clearly despite the shock. "No, Uncle Robert, this isn't your fault, it's Victoria's, and we're going to make her pay for it." Just then, Marcus returned, his expression grim. "Bad news. The FBI is hesitant to meet now, given the allegations against Alex. They're worried about the optics of working with someone under investigation." A heavy silence fell over the room. Their carefully laid plans were crumbling around them. Victoria had outmaneuvered them, turning Alexander from a credible whistleblower into a suspected criminal in one fell swoop. But as Alexander looked around at the faces of his family, his father, worn but determined, his uncle seeking redemption, Marcus, loyal and steadfast, he felt a surge of resolve. "No," he said firmly, drawing everyone's attention. "We're not giving up. Victoria thinks she's won, but she's made a crucial mistake." The others looked at him questioningly. Alexander continued, his voice gaining strength. "She's desperate. This move, accusing me publicly, it's risky. It draws attention not just to me but to Thornton Enterprises, and by extension to her. We can use that." He turned to Marcus. "Call your FBI contact back. Tell them we're coming in, allegations or no allegations. We've got evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy, and it goes way beyond just me or Thornton Enterprises." As Marcus made the call, Alexander addressed his father and uncle. "Dad, Uncle Robert, I need you both to go to Oakwood Manor." Richard's eyes widened in surprise. "The manor? But why?" "Because," Alexander explained, a plan forming in his mind. Victoria will be focused on me, on the fallout from these allegations. She might let her guard down at the manor, and we still need that original deed. Robert nodded, understanding dawning on his face. The hidden compartment in the library. If Victoria didn't find it, the deed might still be there. Exactly, Alexander confirmed. And even if she did find it, there might be other documents, other evidence we can use. It's a risk, but it's one we have to take. As the group prepared to split up, each heading to their respective missions, Alexander felt a mix of fear and determination. They were walking into the lion's den, risking everything on this final gambit. Richard approached his son, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I'm proud of you, Alex," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, you're my son. And together we're going to set things right." Alexander hugged his father back, drawing strength from the older man's unwavering support. As they parted, he looked around at his unlikely team. A disgraced businessman seeking redemption, a private investigator with a strong moral compass, and his father, who had weathered so much but still stood tall. "All right," Alexander said, his voice steady and determined. "Let's go save our family legacy." As they left the safe house, splitting up to their different destinations, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into the final battle. Victoria had played her hand, launching a devastating attack on his reputation and his company. But in doing so, she had also exposed herself. Now it was their turn to strike back. With the truth on their side and the strength of their family bond, they had a fighting chance. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of Oakwood Manor, but the future of the entire Thornton family. What none of them realized was that Victoria, in her desperation, had set in motion events that would have far-reaching consequences. As Alexander and his team made their moves, unseen forces were converging, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. The endgame had begun, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The sun was setting over Oakwood Manor, casting long shadows across the once immaculate grounds. Richard and Robert Thornton crouched in the overgrown shrubbery near the old servants' entrance, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. "Are you sure about this, Richard?" Robert whispered, eyeing the darkened windows of the mansion nervously. Richard nodded, a steely glint in his eyes that reminded Robert of the strong, confident brother he once knew. "We have to do this, Robert. For Alex. For our family. It's time we took back what's ours." With practiced ease that belied his years away, Richard located the hidden latch that opened the servants' door. The brothers slipped inside, finding themselves in a narrow, dusty corridor that led towards the heart of the house. Meanwhile, across town, Alexander stood before the imposing edifice of the FBI field office. Marcus was by his side, a briefcase full of evidence clutched tightly in his hand. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked, echoing his question from earlier that morning. Alexander took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Ready as I'll ever be. Let's go bring down an empire." As they walked through the doors, prepared to present their case to the federal agents, Alexander couldn't help but worry about his father and uncle. He knew the risks they were taking, sneaking into Oakwood Manor, but he also knew it was their best chance at finding the crucial evidence they needed. Back at the manor, Richard and Robert had made their way to the library. The once grand room was a shadow of its former self, with books strewn about and furniture covered in dust cloths. "The hidden compartment should be behind this bookshelf," Richard whispered, running his hands along the ornate woodwork. As they searched, a noise from the hallway made them freeze. Footsteps, growing closer. The brothers exchanged a panicked look before diving behind a large desk, just as the library door swung open. Victoria strode in, followed by two men in suits. Even in the dim light, Richard could see the strain on her face, the wild look in her eyes that spoke of desperation. "Find it," she hissed to the men. "That deed has to be here somewhere. We need it destroyed before those fools can get their hands on it." From their hiding place, Richard and Robert watched as Victoria and her henchmen tore the room apart. Books were thrown to the floor, paintings ripped from walls. It was clear that Victoria was feeling the pressure of Alexander's counterattack. In the FBI office, Alexander and Marcus sat across from two stern-faced agents, laying out their evidence piece by piece. Bank records showing suspicious transfers, sworn statements from employees who had witnessed illegal activities, and a detailed account of Victoria's past frauds and identity changes. "This is substantial," one of the agents admitted, leafing through the documents. "But Mr. Thornton, you have to understand our position. With the allegations against you," Alexander leaned forward, his voice intense. "Those allegations are false, fabricated by Victoria to discredit me. I'm willing to open my entire life to scrutiny to prove it. But right now we have a chance to stop a criminal enterprise that goes far beyond just me or my company. Are you really going to let this opportunity slip away because of some baseless accusations?" The agents exchanged a look, clearly weighing their options. The evidence was compelling, but the political ramifications of moving against such well-connected individuals were significant. Back at Oakwood Manor, the search had reached a fevered pitch. Victoria was becoming more agitated by the moment, snapping orders at her increasingly nervous-looking associates. "It has to be here," she snarled, sweeping a stack of books off a table in frustration. From their hiding place, Richard and Robert hardly dared to breathe. But as they watched Victoria's frantic search, Richard's eyes widened in sudden realization. The hidden compartment, it wasn't behind the bookshelf at all. He had remembered wrong. Slowly, carefully, he leaned close to Robert's ear. "The fireplace," he breathed, so softly it was barely audible. "There's a loose brick." Robert nodded almost imperceptibly. They had one chance at this. As Victoria and her men focused their search on the far side of the room, the brothers began to inch their way towards the grand fireplace that dominated one wall. In the FBI office, a tense silence had fallen. Alexander and Marcus waited, hearts pounding, as the agents conferred in low voices. Finally, the senior agent turned back to them. "All right, Mr. Thornton, we're willing to move forward with an investigation, but I want to be clear. If we find any evidence that you're involved in illegal activities, we won't hesitate to prosecute." Alexander nodded, relief washing over him. "I understand. Thank you." As the agents began to make calls, setting the wheels of justice in motion, Alexander's thoughts turned to his father and uncle. He could only hope they had found what they needed at Oakwood Manor. In the library, Richard's fingers trembled as he felt along the inside of the fireplace. Just when he was beginning to doubt himself, he felt it, a slight give in one of the bricks. With a barely audible click, a small compartment opened. Inside was a stack of papers, yellowed with age, but still intact. On top was the original deed to Oakwood Manor. But there was something else, a letter addressed to "My dear descendants" in flowing script. Just as Richard pulled the documents from their hiding place, a gasp from across the room made his blood run cold. "Well, well," Victoria's voice dripped with venom. "Look who's decided to join our little treasure hunt." Richard and Robert slowly stood, the precious documents clutched tightly in Richard's hand. Victoria's eyes locked onto the papers, a mix of triumph and desperation in her gaze. "Hand those over, Richard," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "You've lost. It's over." But as Victoria took a step forward, the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights began to flash through the windows. The cavalry had arrived. Victoria's face drained of color. She turned to run, but found her path blocked by her own associates, who clearly sensed which way the wind was blowing. As the sounds of FBI agents entering the house echoed through the halls, Richard unfolded the letter with shaking hands. As he read, his eyes widened. "My God," he whispered. "Alex needs to see this." Outside, Alexander emerged from an FBI vehicle, his heart racing as he took in the scene. Oakwood Manor, his childhood home, now swarming with federal agents. And there, being led out in handcuffs, was Victoria. Their eyes met for a moment. Alexander saw the defeat in her gaze, the realization that her empire was crumbling around her. But he felt no satisfaction, only a profound sense of relief that it was finally over. As Victoria was placed in a waiting car, Alexander caught sight of two familiar figures emerging from the house, his father and uncle, looking tired but triumphant. And in Richard's hand, a stack of papers that Alexander knew would change everything. The Thornton men converged on the front steps of Oakwood Manor, their family home that had seen so much joy, pain, and now, finally, justice. As Richard handed the documents to his son, a sense of completion washed over them all. The battle for Oakwood Manor was over. Who else could it be? Alexander stood, pacing the room as he gathered his thoughts. Think about it. Who was it that suffered the most under Victoria's schemes? Who showed true resilience in the face of adversity? Who, despite everything, never lost sight of what really matters? He turned to face his father, a smile spreading across his face. It's you, Dad. You're the one who should be the steward of Oakwood Manor and the trust. Richard's eyes widened in shock. Me? But Alex, I'm not... I mean, after everything that happened with Victoria, how can I be trusted with such a responsibility? Alexander knelt beside his father's chair, taking the older man's hands in his own. Because you never gave up. Even when Victoria stripped you of everything, even when you thought you had lost it all, you held on to your integrity. You're the living embodiment of the values Ezra Thornton wanted to preserve. Robert nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. He's right, Richard. You've been tested in ways none of us have, and you've come through it stronger, more compassionate. If anyone deserves this legacy, it's you. Richard looked from his son to his brother, tears welling in his eyes. I don't know what to say. Are you sure about this, Alex? This was meant to be your inheritance. Alexander stood, his voice firm with conviction. Oakwood Manor was never about inheritance for me, Dad. It was about family, about preserving something precious, and there's no one I trust more to honor that than you. As the weight of the decision settled over them, a knock at the library door interrupted their conversation. Marcus entered, his face serious. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but there's something you all need to see. He handed Alexander a folder. Inside were documents detailing the full extent of Victoria's criminal enterprise. Shell companies, offshore accounts, bribes paid to local officials, it was all laid bare. The FBI has officially filed charges, Marcus explained. Victoria, her associates, even some of the corrupt officials she worked with, they're all going down. But here's the kicker. They found evidence linking all of this back to a larger organization. This goes way beyond just Oakwood Manor. The Thornton men exchanged glances, the magnitude of what they had uncovered sinking in. Their fight for their family home had inadvertently exposed a vast criminal network that had been operating in the shadows for years. As they pored over the documents, discussing the implications with Marcus, a sense of purpose settled over the room. The battle for Oakwood Manor was over, but a new chapter was just beginning. Richard, once beaten down and lost, now sat straighter, a glint of determination in his eyes. Robert, seeking redemption, saw a path forward to make amends for his past mistakes. And Alexander, who had started this journey seeking only to save his family home, now realized that his true calling lay in using his skills and resources to fight for justice on a larger scale. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the library windows, the Thornton men stood together, united in purpose. Oakwood Manor had been saved, but more importantly, it had been given new meaning. The legacy of Ezra Thornton, hidden for so long, would now guide them forward. And as they looked to the future, they knew that the greatest challenges and the greatest opportunities to make a difference still lay ahead. 1 year had passed since the fateful day when the Thornton family reclaimed Oakwood Manor. The once neglected estate now bustled with activity, its grounds meticulously maintained and its halls filled with the warmth of purpose. Richard Thornton stood on the front steps, watching as a group of children played on the newly installed playground equipment. The sound of their laughter brought a smile to his face, a stark contrast to the man he had been just a year ago. Quite a change, isn't it? Alexander's voice came from behind him. Richard turned to see his son approaching, a tablet in hand and a look of satisfaction on his face. It's more than I ever could have imagined, Richard replied, his voice filled with emotion. When you first suggested I take on this responsibility, I was terrified. But now... Alexander placed a hand on his father's shoulder. Now you're thriving. And so is Oakwood Manor. Indeed, under Richard's stewardship, Oakwood Manor had been transformed. The estate now housed a community centre, offering programs for underprivileged youth, job training for adults, and support services for families in need. The grounds had been partially converted into community gardens, providing fresh produce for local food banks. "The latest report from the Trust," Alexander said, handing the tablet to his father. "The outreach programs have helped over 1,000 families in the past year. Employment rates in the county are up, crime is down, and we're seeing real, measurable improvements in education outcomes." Richard scrolled through the report, his eyes misting over. "Ezra would be proud," he said softly. "We're living up to his vision, using Oakwood Manor to make a real difference." As they walked back into the house, they passed the library, now a bustling educational center. Through the open door, they could see Robert leading a group of teenagers in a lively discussion about business ethics. "Uncle Robert seems to have found his calling," Alexander observed. Richard nodded, a hint of pride in his voice. "He's determined to make amends for his past, teaching these kids about the importance of integrity in business. It's his way of ensuring the mistakes of the past aren't repeated." They made their way to Richard's office, once Victoria's domain, now a warm, inviting space filled with plans and proposals for future community projects. As they settled in, Alexander couldn't help but marvel at the change in his father. The defeated, broken man of a year ago was gone, replaced by someone vibrant, purposeful, and deeply fulfilled. "So," Richard said, leaning back in his chair, "how are things on your end? Any progress with the task force?" Alexander's face lit up with excitement. "Actually, that's part of why I'm here. We've had a major breakthrough." Over the past year, Alexander had been working with the FBI, using his business acumen and the evidence they had uncovered to track down the larger criminal organization behind Victoria's schemes. It had become his mission, a way to ensure that what happened to their family could never happen to anyone else. "We've identified the key players," Alexander explained, pulling out his own tablet and bringing up a series of documents. "Shell companies, money laundering operations, even some high-level political connections. It's all coming together." Richard leaned forward, studying the information with keen interest. "This is incredible, Alex. But it's also dangerous. Are you sure you want to keep pursuing this?" Alexander's expression turned serious. "I have to, Dad. What happened to us? It's happening to other families, other communities. Someone has to stand up to these people." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. It was Marcus, looking slightly out of breath. "Sorry to barge in," he said, "but I've got news, big news." Over the next hour, Marcus laid out the details of their latest discovery. The criminal network they had been tracking was on the verge of a major move, one that would consolidate their power and make them virtually untouchable. "We have a chance to stop them," Marcus concluded, "but we have to move fast and it's going to be risky." Richard looked from Marcus to Alexander, concern etched on his face. "Son, you don't have to do this. You've already done so much. Maybe it's time to let the authorities handle it from here." But Alexander shook his head, a familiar determination in his eyes. "This is bigger than us now, Dad. It's about protecting everything we've built here, everything Oakwood Manor stands for. If these people succeed, how many other families will suffer? How many other communities will be torn apart?" Richard studied his son's face for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "You're right, this is what Ezra would have wanted, using our resources, our position, to fight for what's right." He turned to Marcus. "What do you need from us?" As Marcus began outlining their plan, a sense of purpose filled the room. This wasn't just about Oakwood Manor anymore. It was about standing up for justice, about using their newfound strength and unity to make a real difference in the world. Hours later, as the sun began to set, the three men stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds of Oakwood Manor. Children were being picked up from after-school programs, community members were tending to the gardens, and the whole estate hummed with the energy of lives being changed. The estate now housed a community centre, offering programs for underprivileged youth, job training for adults, and support services for families in need. The grounds had been partially converted into community gardens, providing fresh produce for local food banks. "The latest report from the Trust," Alexander said, handing the tablet to his father. "The outreach programs have helped over 1,000 families in the past year. Employment rates in the county are up, crime is down, and we're seeing real, measurable improvements in education outcomes. Richard scrolled through the report, his eyes misting over. Ezra would be proud, he said softly. We're living up to his vision, using Oakwood Manor to make a real difference. As they walked back into the house, they passed the library, now a bustling educational center. Through the open door, they could see Robert leading a group of teenagers in a lively discussion about business ethics. Uncle Robert seems to have found his calling, Alexander observed. Richard nodded, a hint of pride in his voice. He's determined to make amends for his past. Teaching these kids about the importance of integrity in business, it's his way of ensuring the mistakes of the past aren't repeated. They made their way to Richard's office, once Victoria's domain, now a warm, inviting space filled with plans and proposals for future community projects. As they settled in, Alexander couldn't help but marvel at the change in his father. The defeated, broken man of a year ago was gone, replaced by someone vibrant, purposeful, and deeply fulfilled. So, Richard said, leaning back in his chair, how are things on your end? Any progress with the task force? Alexander's face lit up with excitement. Actually, that's part of why I'm here. We've had a major breakthrough. Over the past year, Alexander had been working with the FBI, using his business acumen and the evidence they had uncovered to track down the larger criminal organization behind Victoria's schemes. It had become his mission, a way to ensure that what happened to their family could never happen to anyone else. We've identified the key players, Alexander explained, pulling out his own tablet and bringing up a series of documents, shell companies, money laundering operations, even some high-level political connections. It's all coming together. Richard leaned forward, studying the information with keen interest. This is incredible, Alex, but it's also dangerous. Are you sure you want to keep pursuing this? Alexander's expression turned serious. I have to, Dad. What happened to us? It's happening to other families, other communities. Someone has to stand up to these people. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. It was Marcus, looking slightly out of breath. Sorry to barge in, he said, but I've got news, big news. Over the next hour, Marcus laid out the details of their latest discovery. The criminal network they had been tracking was on the verge of a major move, one that would consolidate their power and make them virtually untouchable. We have a chance to stop them, Marcus concluded, but we have to move fast and it's going to be risky. Richard looked from Marcus to Alexander, concern etched on his face. Son, you don't have to do this. You've already done so much. Maybe it's time to let the authorities handle it from here. But Alexander shook his head, a familiar determination in his eyes. This is bigger than us now, Dad. It's about protecting everything we've built here, everything Oakwood Manor stands for. If these people succeed, how many other families will suffer? How many other communities will be torn apart? Richard studied his son's face for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. You're right, this is what Ezra would have wanted, using our resources, our position, to fight for what's right. He turned to Marcus. What do you need from us? As Marcus began outlining their plan, a sense of purpose filled the room. This wasn't just about Oakwood Manor anymore. It was about standing up for justice, about using their newfound strength and unity to make a real difference in the world. Hours later, as the sun began to set, the three men stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds of Oakwood Manor. Children were being picked up from after-school programs, community members were tending to the gardens, and the whole estate hummed with the energy of lives being changed. Whatever happens next, Alexander said, we've already accomplished something amazing here. Richard nodded, putting an arm around his son's shoulders. And we'll face whatever comes together, as a family. As they stood there, taking in the scene before them, each man reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The pain, the betrayals, the hard-won victories, all of it had led to this moment, to this new beginning. Oakwood Manor, once a symbol of faded glory and painful memories, now stood as a beacon of hope. And the Thornton family, once fractured and lost, had found new strength in their unity and purpose. As night fell and lights began to twinkle across the estate, they knew that challenges lay ahead. The fight against corruption and injustice would not be easy, but with the legacy of Ezra Thornton to guide them, the support of their community behind them, and the bonds of family stronger than ever. They were ready to face whatever the future might bring. The story of Oakwood Manor and the Thornton family was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. A new chapter was unfolding, one filled with promise, purpose, and the enduring power of love and legacy. As they turned to go back inside, ready to face the challenges that awaited them, they carried with them the knowledge that together they could overcome anything. The true strength of Oakwood Manor, they had learned, lay not in its walls or its history, but in the hearts of those who called it home and in the lives it touched. The battle for Oakwood Manor was over, but the legacy it inspired was just beginning to unfold. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Alexander Thornton made his way up the winding path to Oakwood Manor. It had been 6 months since the family's triumphant reclaiming of their ancestral home, and the estate was slowly but surely coming back to life. As he approached the grand entrance, Alexander couldn't help but smile at the sight of children playing on the newly installed playground equipment. The sound of their laughter was a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had permeated the property during Victoria's reign. "Mr. Thornton," a voice called out. Alexander turned to see Mrs. Henderson, the coordinator of the newly established community center, hurrying towards him. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Alexander greeted her warmly. "How are things going with the after-school program?" The older woman beamed with pride. "Wonderfully. We've just added a new STEM workshop and the kids are absolutely loving it, but..." Her voice trailed off, her expression turning serious. "There's something I need to discuss with you and your father. Is he available?" Alexander nodded, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "He should be in his study. Shall we?" As they made their way through the manor, Alexander marveled at the transformation. Gone were the dusty sheets and neglected furnishings. In their place, the halls bustled with activity, volunteers organizing donations, community members attending workshops, and the ever-present laughter of children. They found Richard in his study, poring over financial reports. He looked up as they entered, his face lighting up at the sight of his son. "Alex, I wasn't expecting you until later. And Mrs. Henderson, always a pleasure. What brings you both here?" "Mrs." Henderson hesitated, wringing her hands nervously. "Mr. Thornton, I'm afraid we've run into a bit of a situation with one of our new students." Richard's brow furrowed with concern. "What kind of situation?" "It's about young Tommy Baker," Mrs. Henderson explained. "He's been acting out lately, causing disruptions in class. We've tried talking to him, but he's closed off. Then yesterday I overheard him talking to one of our volunteers. He mentioned something about his father working for Victoria. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Alexander and Richard exchanged worried glances. "Do we know anything about Tommy's family?" Alexander asked, his mind already racing with possibilities. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "Not much. They're new to the area. Tommy's mother works long hours at the hospital. The father, well, we haven't seen him." Richard stood, his face set with determination. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Mrs. Henderson. We'll look into it. In the meantime, please, continue to show Tommy all the patience and understanding you can." After Mrs. Henderson left, Alexander turned to his father. "You don't think Victoria could be..." Richard held up a hand, cutting him off. "Let's not jump to conclusions, but we can't ignore this either. Victoria may be gone, but the damage she did? It could have far-reaching consequences we haven't even considered." Alexander nodded, a familiar sense of purpose settling over him. "I'll reach out to Marcus, see if he can do some digging on the Baker family. In the meantime, maybe we should try talking to Tommy ourselves." As they discussed their next steps, neither man could shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The echoes of Victoria's reign were still reverberating through their community, and it would take more than just renovating Oakwood Manor to truly heal the wounds she had inflicted. Later that afternoon, Alexander found himself sitting across from Tommy Baker in the manor's library. The boy was small for his 10 years, with a mop of unruly brown hair and eyes that seemed too old for his young face. "You're not in trouble, Tommy," Alexander said gently. "We just want to understand what's going on. Mrs. Henderson says you've been having a hard time lately." Tommy shrugged, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It's nothing. I'm fine. Alexander leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. Tommy, we can't help if we don't know what's wrong. Is everything okay at home? The boy's head snapped up, fear flashing in his eyes. You can't tell my dad I talked to you. He'll get mad. He says we're not supposed to talk about before. Alexander's heart clenched. Before what, Tommy? Tears welled up in the boy's eyes. Before we moved here. Dad used to work for a lady named Victoria. He said she was going to make us rich. But then something happened and we had to leave really fast. Dad lost his job and now he's always angry. As Tommy's story unfolded, Alexander felt a mix of sympathy for the boy and anger towards Victoria. Even now, months after her downfall, her actions were still causing ripples of pain and fear. By the time Tommy left, escorted by a kind-hearted volunteer to join the other children in their after-school activities, Alexander had made up his mind. This wasn't just about one family. There could be others out there, other victims of Victoria's schemes who were still suffering in silence. He found his father in the garden, tending to the roses that had once been his mother's pride and joy. Dad, Alexander said, his voice filled with determination, I think we need to expand our outreach programs. There are people out there, people like Tommy's family who are still dealing with the fallout from Victoria's actions. We need to find them, help them. Richard straightened, wiping his hands on his gardening apron. There was a glint in his eye that Alexander recognized, the same look he'd had when they first decided to fight for Oakwood Manor. You're right, son, Richard said. Oakwood Manor was just the beginning. We have a responsibility to our community, to all those who might have been hurt by Victoria and her associates. As father and son began to plan, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the grounds of Oakwood Manor. The challenges ahead were daunting, but together, the Thorntons were ready to face them. They had reclaimed their home, but now it was time to help others reclaim their lives. The true legacy of Oakwood Manor was just beginning to unfold. The conference room at Oakwood Manor buzzed with nervous energy. Around the large oak table sat an eclectic group, social workers, former employees of Victoria's various shell companies, and families who had been impacted by her schemes. At the head of the table, Alexander and Richard Thornton exchanged determined glances. Thank you all for coming, Richard began, his voice warm but tinged with solemnity. We've gathered you here today because each of you, in your own way, has been affected by the actions of Victoria Blackwood and her associates. A murmur rippled through the room. Some faces showed fear, others anger, and a few hope. Alexander stood, his presence commanding attention. We know that coming forward wasn't easy for any of you, but by being here, you're taking the first step towards healing, not just for yourselves, but for our entire community. Over the next few hours, stories poured out, tales of financial ruin, of families torn apart by secrets and lies, of dreams shattered by Victoria's manipulations. With each account, the magnitude of the task ahead became clearer to the Thorntons. Among the attendees was Janet Baker, Tommy's mother. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of determination in her gaze. I didn't know about my husband's involvement with Victoria until it was too late, Janet shared, her voice quavering. By the time I realized what was happening, we were in too deep. When it all fell apart, we lost everything. My husband, he couldn't cope. He left us. Alexander leaned forward, his voice gentle. Mrs. Baker, I want you to know that you and Tommy are not alone. None of you are. Oakwood Manor is committed to helping each and every person impacted by Victoria's actions. As the meeting progressed, ideas began to flow. Support groups, job training programs, counseling services. The seeds of a comprehensive community healing initiative were being sown. Later that evening, as the last of the attendees departed, Richard found Alexander standing by the window, his gaze distant. Penny for your thoughts, son? Richard asked, joining him. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. I knew the damage Victoria had done was extensive, but this... Dad, how do we even begin to address all of this? Richard placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. One step at a time, Alex. Remember what Ezra wrote in his letter about using our resources for the betterment of the community? This is exactly what he meant. Alexander nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. "We need to create a foundation," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Something separate from Oakwood Manor but aligned with its mission. An organization dedicated to helping victims of corporate fraud and manipulation rebuild their lives." Richard's eyes lit up. "The Thornton Foundation for Community Restoration," he mused. "I like the sound of that." Over the next few weeks, Oakwood Manor was a hive of activity. Legal experts were consulted, paperwork filed, and plans drawn up. The Thornton Foundation quickly took shape, with Alexander at the helm and Richard serving as a senior advisor. One sunny morning, as Alexander was reviewing the Foundation's first round of grant proposals, a familiar face appeared in his office doorway. "Uncle Robert," Alexander said, surprised. His uncle had been keeping a low profile since the events with Victoria, focusing on making amends in his own quiet way. Robert entered the office looking nervous but determined. "Alex, I've been thinking. I want to help with the foundation. I know I can never fully make up for my role in Victoria's schemes, but maybe I can use my knowledge to prevent others from falling into the same traps." Alexander studied his uncle's face, seeing genuine remorse and a desire for redemption. After a moment, he nodded. "Actually, Uncle Robert, I think I have the perfect role for you." And so, the Thornton Foundation's education initiative was born. Robert, drawing on his years of experience in the business world, both the ethical and unethical sides, developed a series of workshops and seminars. These programs were designed to help small business owners and individuals recognize and avoid fraudulent schemes. As autumn gave way to winter, the impact of the Thornton Foundation began to ripple through the community. Janet Baker, with the help of job training programs, secured a better-paying position at the hospital. Tommy's grades improved, and he became an enthusiastic participant in the Manor's after-school programs. Other families, emboldened by the support they received, began to come forward with their stories. Slowly but surely, a network of healing and support spread throughout the county. One chilly evening, as snowflakes danced outside the windows of Oakwood Manor, the Thornton men gathered in the library. Richard, Alexander, and Robert sat before the crackling fireplace, each nursing a glass of Ezra's favorite whiskey. "You know," Robert said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for everything that's happened. Not the pain we caused, of course, but it led us here. It gave us a chance to make real, meaningful change." Richard nodded, his eyes misting slightly. "Ezra would be proud. We're not just preserving a house or a family name. We're building something that will outlast all of us." Alexander raised his glass in a toast. "To the Thornton legacy, not of wealth or power, but of compassion, integrity, and community." As their glasses clinked together, the portrait of Ezra Thornton seemed to smile down at them from above the mantel. Outside, the lights of Oakwood Manor shone like a beacon in the winter night, a symbol of hope and renewal for all who saw it. The journey of healing had only just begun, but with each passing day, the bridges of trust between the Thorntons and their community grew stronger. The true restoration of Oakwood Manor, not just of its physical structure, but of its spirit and purpose, was well underway. Spring had come to Oakwood Manor, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility. The grounds were alive with color, daffodils and crocuses dotting the lawns, cherry blossoms painting the air with delicate pink petals. But it wasn't just the landscape that was transforming. In the grand ballroom, now converted into a multi-purpose community space, Alexander stood before a crowd of eager faces. Local business owners, community leaders, and families who had benefited from the Thornton Foundation's programs filled the rows of chairs. "Welcome, everyone, to the first annual Oakwood Manor Community Summit," Alexander began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "A year ago, this place was a symbol of isolation and decay. Today, it stands as a testament to what we can achieve when we come together." As Alexander spoke, outlining the Foundation's achievements and future plans, Richard watched from the back of the room, his heart swelling with pride. His son had taken the reins of their family legacy and steered it in a direction that exceeded even Ezra's wildest dreams. The summit was more than just a celebration of their progress. It was a forum for new ideas, a place where community members could voice their needs and collaborate on solutions. Throughout the day, workshops and panel discussions covered topics ranging from sustainable local businesses to mental health support services. In one corner of the ballroom, Robert led a packed session on financial literacy and fraud prevention. His past experiences, once a source of shame, had become a powerful teaching tool. The attendees hung on his every word, many taking copious notes. As the day wore on, Alexander found himself drawn into conversation after conversation. He listened to stories of lives changed, businesses saved, and hope restored. But one interaction in particular stood out. "Mr. Thornton?" A hesitant voice called out as Alexander was between sessions. He turned to see Tommy Baker, the young boy whose story had first alerted them to the ongoing impact of Victoria's schemes. "Tommy, how are you doing?" Alexander asked, kneeling down to the boy's level. Tommy's face broke into a wide grin. "I'm great. Mom says I can join the robotics club at school now that she's got her new job. And Dad came home last week." Alexander's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Your father's back." Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "He said he's sorry for leaving. He's been going to those meetings Mr. Robert runs. Mom says we're going to try to be a family again." As Tommy ran off to join his mother, Alexander felt a complex mix of emotions. The Baker family's journey was far from over, but they had taken the first steps towards healing. It was a stark reminder of the real human impact of their work. Later that evening, as the summit wound down, Alexander found himself on the manor's expansive back porch with his father and uncle. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, a fitting end to a day filled with promise. "I'd say that was a resounding success," Richard said, clapping his son on the back. "You've done an incredible job, Alex." Alexander shook his head, a humble smile on his face. "We've done an incredible job, Dad. All of us. Including you, Uncle Robert." Robert, who had been quietly sipping his iced tea, looked up in surprise. "Me? But You've become an integral part of this, Uncle Robert," Alexander insisted. "Your workshops are making a real difference. People trust you because you've been there. You understand what they're going through." A comfortable silence fell over the three men as they contemplated the day's events and the journey that had brought them to this point. It was Richard who finally broke the quiet. "You know, I've been thinking," he began, his voice thoughtful. "What we're doing here, it's bigger than just our community. There are people all over the country, all over the world, dealing with the aftermath of corporate fraud and corruption." Alexander nodded slowly, seeing where his father was going. "You think we should expand?" "I think we need to," Richard replied. "We have the resources, the knowledge, and now the experience. Imagine what we could do on a larger scale." The idea took root, growing and evolving as they discussed the possibilities. By the time the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, the outlines of a bold new plan had emerged. "A national network of community restoration centers," Alexander mused, his eyes alight with excitement. "Each one modeled after what we've done here at Oakwood Manor, but tailored to the specific needs of its community." Robert leaned forward, his business acumen kicking in. "We'd need to start small, perhaps with a pilot program in a few select cities. We could use our connections from the summit to identify potential partners in other regions." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "And we'd need to be careful not to lose sight of our core mission. This isn't about building an empire, it's about helping people rebuild their lives." As they continued to flesh out the idea, the enormity of what they were proposing began to sink in. This wasn't just about expanding their foundation, it was about potentially reshaping the way communities across the country dealt with the aftermath of corporate fraud and corruption. The next morning, Alexander called an emergency meeting of the Thornton Foundation's Board of Directors. The boardroom, once a symbol of corporate power under Victoria's reign, now buzzed with an energy of hope and possibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, standing at the head of the table, "what I'm about to propose is ambitious, perhaps even audacious, but I believe it's the natural evolution of everything we've accomplished here at Oakwood Manor." Over the next hour, Alexander laid out the plan for a national network of community restoration centers. He spoke of partnerships with local organizations, of tailored programs designed to address the unique challenges faced by different communities, of a comprehensive approach that would combine economic support, education, and emotional healing. The board members listened intently, their expressions a mix of excitement and apprehension. When Alexander finished, there was a moment of silence before the questions began. "The financial implications of this would be enormous," one board member pointed out. "How do you propose we fund such an expansive program?" Alexander had anticipated this question. "We'll start by allocating a portion of the Thornton Foundation's endowment. But more importantly, we'll leverage our success here at Oakwood Manor to attract partners and donors who share our vision." Another board member raised her hand. "And what about the legal challenges? Expanding to a national level would bring us under much greater scrutiny." This time it was Robert who spoke up. "I've already begun consultations with our legal team. We'll need to navigate complex regulatory environments, but our transparency and commitment to ethical practices will be our greatest asset." The discussion continued late into the afternoon, with every aspect of the plan examined and debated. By the time the meeting adjourned, there was a palpable sense of excitement in the room. The board had given their provisional approval, contingent on the development of a more detailed implementation strategy. As the board members filed out, Richard pulled Alexander aside. "You did well in there, son, but are you sure you're ready for this? It's going to be a massive undertaking." Alexander met his father's gaze, his jaw set with determination. "I'm sure, Dad. This is what Oakwood Manor has been preparing us for all along. It's time to take what we've learned here and use it to make a difference on a larger scale." Richard smiled, a mix of pride and nostalgia in his eyes. "You remind me so much of your mother right now. She always believed in dreaming big and then working tirelessly to make those dreams a reality." The mention of his mother sent a pang through Alexander's heart. She had passed away long before the troubles with Victoria, but her influence on the family remained strong. "Do you think she would have approved of this plan?" "Approved?" Richard chuckled. "She would have been leading the charge. Your mother always said that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the positive impact we have on others' lives." Energized by his father's words, Alexander threw himself into the work of bringing their ambitious plan to life. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Teams were assembled to develop detailed proposals for pilot programs in 3 cities. Meetings were held with potential partners and donors. The legal team worked around the clock to navigate the complex regulatory landscape. Through it all, the core values that had guided the restoration of Oakwood Manor remained at the forefront: integrity, compassion, and a commitment to empowering communities to rebuild and thrive. As spring gave way to summer, the first tangible steps towards their national vision began to take shape. A struggling neighborhood in Detroit was selected as the site for their first pilot program. An abandoned community center was purchased, and renovations began, guided by the lessons learned from Oakwood Manor. One warm evening, as Alexander stood on the porch of Oakwood Manor, watching the sun set over the thriving community gardens, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The journey that had begun with a fight to reclaim their family home had evolved into something far greater than he could have imagined. Oakwood Manor was no longer just a place, it was an idea, a blueprint for healing and restoration that had the potential to touch lives across the nation. As he gazed out at the families enjoying the gardens, the children laughing on the playgrounds, and the bustling activity around the community center, Alexander knew that this was just the beginning. The ripples of change that had started here at Oakwood Manor were growing into waves, carrying with them the promise of renewal and hope for communities far beyond their own. And the Thornton family, once nearly torn apart by greed and deception, now stood united in their commitment to making that promise a reality. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Alexander turned to go back inside, ready to face whatever challenges the next phase of their journey might bring. The legacy of Oakwood Manor was no longer confined to its walls or grounds. It lived in the spirit of transformation and community that they were now poised to share with the world. The Detroit summer sun beat down mercilessly on Alexander as he stood before the dilapidated building that would soon become the first satellite of the Thornton Foundation's national initiative. The peeling paint and boarded-up windows were a stark contrast to the meticulously restored Oakwood Manor, but Alexander saw beyond the current state to the potential within. "It's going to be a lot of work," said Maria Rodriguez, the local community organizer who had become their point person for the Detroit project. Her voice held a mix of skepticism and hope. Alexander nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. It is. But if we've learned anything from Oakwood Manor, it's that the physical restoration is just the beginning. The real work is in rebuilding the community's spirit. As they walked the perimeter of the property, discussing plans for renovation and program implementation, Alexander's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. He glanced at the screen to see his father's name flashing. "Excuse me for a moment," he said to Maria, stepping aside to take the call. "Dad, is everything okay?" Richard's voice came through, tense and worried. "Alex, we've hit a snag with the Chicago project. The local alderman is blocking our permits. He's claiming we don't have proper community support." Alexander's brow furrowed. They had been so careful in their approach, ensuring they had grassroots backing before moving forward. "That doesn't make sense. We've been working with community leaders there for months." "I know," Richard sighed, "but it seems the alderman has ties to a developer who had their eye on the property we purchased. They're painting us as outsiders, trying to gentrify the neighborhood." The irony of the accusation wasn't lost on Alexander. Their entire mission was about empowering communities, not displacing them. "All right, I'll fly out there tomorrow. We need to address this head-on." As he ended the call, Alexander felt the weight of their ambitious undertaking settling heavily on his shoulders. Expanding nationally was proving to be far more complex than they had anticipated. Back at their temporary Detroit headquarters, a modest office space donated by a local supporter, Alexander convened an emergency video conference with the project leads from each of their pilot cities. "All right, team," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "We're facing some challenges, but that's to be expected. This is new territory for all of us." Over the next hour, they discussed the various hurdles each project was encountering. In Chicago, it was political resistance. In Atlanta, they were struggling to recruit qualified local staff. The Detroit project was on track, but facing skepticism from some community members who had been burned by empty promises of revitalization in the past. As the meeting wound down, Robert's face appeared on the screen. He had been overseeing the Atlanta project. "Alex, I think we need to consider slowing down our expansion. We might be stretching ourselves too thin." There was a murmur of agreement from some of the other team members. Alexander felt a flicker of frustration, but he pushed it down. "I hear your concerns," he said carefully, "but let's not forget why we're doing this. Every delay means more families struggling, more communities left vulnerable to the kind of exploitation we saw with Victoria." He paused, looking at each face on the screen. "I'm not saying it will be easy, but I believe in what we're doing, and I believe in this team. We'll adapt, we'll learn, and we'll keep moving forward." The meeting ended on a cautiously optimistic note, but as Alexander shut down his laptop, he couldn't shake a nagging doubt. Were they moving too fast? Had their success at Oakwood Manor made them overconfident? That night, as he lay in his hotel room unable to sleep, Alexander's thoughts drifted to the families they were trying to help. He thought of Tommy Baker and his mother, of the other faces he'd seen at Oakwood Manor, people whose lives had been transformed by their work. The memory steeled his resolve. They had to find a way to make this expansion work. The next morning, Alexander boarded a plane to Chicago, armed with determination and a hastily crafted strategy to win over the skeptical alderman. As the plane took off, he gazed out the window at the patchwork of communities below, each with its own stories, its own struggles, its own potential for renewal. In Chicago, Alexander found himself in a small, stuffy office, face to face with Alderman Jenkins, a man whose political savvy was evident in every carefully chosen word. "Mr. Thornton," Jenkins began, leaning back in his chair, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you have to understand. This community has seen its share of well-meaning outsiders with big plans, plans that often end up benefiting everyone but the people who actually live here." Alexander leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Alderman, I hear your concerns, but we're not developers looking to flip properties for a quick profit. Our mission is to empower communities, to provide the resources and support they need to rebuild on their own terms." He pulled out a tablet, bringing up images of Oakwood Manor and the thriving community programs they had established. "This is what we've achieved in our hometown, but more importantly, let me show you what the community itself has accomplished with our support." Over the next hour, Alexander shared stories and data, painting a vivid picture of lives changed and communities strengthened. He spoke of job training programs, of small business incubators, of youth mentorship initiatives, all led by local community members. As he talked, Alexander could see the alderman's skepticism slowly giving way to interest. By the end of the meeting, Jenkins was nodding thoughtfully. "You've given me a lot to think about, Mr. Thornton," he said, standing to shake Alexander's hand. "I can't promise anything, but I'm willing to take a closer look at your proposal. Set up a town hall, let the community hear directly from you. If they're on board, you'll have my support." As Alexander left the alderman's office, he felt a mix of relief and renewed determination. It was a small victory, but an important one. More than that, it was a valuable lesson in the importance of tailoring their approach to each unique community they hoped to serve. That evening, as he prepared to fly back to Detroit, Alexander called his father to update him on the situation in Chicago. "Well done, son," Richard said, pride evident in his voice. "But remember, winning over the alderman is just the first step. The real test will be earning the trust of the community itself." Alexander nodded, even though his father couldn't see him. "I know, Dad. But I think I'm starting to understand something. This national expansion, it's not about replicating Oakwood Manor exactly. It's about taking the principles we've learned and adapting them to each new community we work with." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then Richard chuckled softly. "You know, Alex, I think you've just hit on something important. Something that would make your great-grandfather Ezra very proud." As Alexander boarded his flight, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges they faced were significant, but not insurmountable. With each obstacle overcome, with each community engaged, they were learning and growing. The Thornton legacy was evolving, expanding beyond the boundaries of Oakwood Manor. It was becoming a blueprint for community renewal, adaptable and resilient, much like the families they sought to help. As the plane took off, carrying him back to Detroit and the next phase of their ambitious project, Alexander knew that the journey ahead would be difficult. But he also knew that with each step, they were getting closer to realizing a vision of hope and restoration that could transform lives across the nation. The true test of their resolve and the real impact of their work was just beginning. The Chicago Town Hall meeting was packed to capacity. Alexander stood at the podium, facing a sea of faces that ranged from curious to openly skeptical. Alderman Jenkins sat in the front row, his expression unreadable. "Good evening, everyone," Alexander began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I'm here tonight to talk to you about the Thornton Foundation and our vision for community restoration. But more importantly, I'm here to listen to you, to understand your hopes and concerns for this neighborhood." As Alexander outlined their plans, he could feel the tension in the room. When he opened the floor for questions, hands shot up immediately. "How do we know this isn't just another gentrification scheme?" one woman asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Alexander took a deep breath. "That's a fair question. Our goal isn't to push anyone out, but to lift everyone up. We don't just renovate buildings, we invest in people. Job training, small business support, youth programs, all designed and run by members of the community." Another resident stood up. "We've heard promises before. What makes you different?" Before Alexander could respond, an unexpected voice chimed in from the back of the room. "I can answer that." All heads turned to see a middle-aged man standing up. Alexander recognized him as Michael Dawson, a community leader from their Detroit project. "I'm Michael Dawson from Detroit," he introduced himself. "6 months ago, I was just as skeptical as you all are now. But I've seen firsthand what the Thornton Foundation can do when they work hand in hand with the community." Michael went on to share his experience, speaking passionately about the positive changes he'd witnessed in his own neighborhood. As he talked, Alexander could see the mood in the room starting to shift. By the end of the meeting, there was a cautious optimism in the air. Alderman Jenkins approached Alexander, a slight smile on his face. "Well, Mr. Thornton, it seems you've made quite an impression. You'll have my support moving forward." As the crowd dispersed, Alexander felt a mix of relief and excitement. They had cleared a major hurdle, But the real work was just beginning. Back at their temporary Chicago office, Alexander debriefed with his team via video conference. His father and uncle were both on the call. "Excellent work, Alex," Richard said, pride evident in his voice. "But remember, winning their support is just the first step. Now comes the challenge of delivering on our promises." Robert chimed in, his face serious. "And we need to be prepared for pushback. Success in Chicago and Detroit will likely draw attention, not all of it positive." Alexander nodded, understanding the weight of their words. "You're right. We need to stay vigilant and keep our focus on the communities we're serving." As the meeting wrapped up, Alexander couldn't shake a feeling of unease. They were gaining momentum, but with each success, the stakes grew higher. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. In Chicago, they broke ground on their first community center. In Detroit, their job training program celebrated its first group of graduates. And in Atlanta, they finally overcame their staffing challenges, assembling a team of local experts passionate about community development. But as Robert had predicted, their success was starting to draw attention. One morning, Alexander woke to find his inbox flooded with press inquiries. A national news outlet had run a feature on their work, praising their innovative approach to community restoration. While the positive coverage was welcome, it also brought increased scrutiny. Critics began to emerge, questioning the Thornton Foundation's motives and methods. In the midst of this, Alexander received an unexpected call from Marcus, their old friend and private investigator. "Alex, we might have a problem," Marcus said, his voice tense. "I've been keeping an ear to the ground, and there are whispers about a group trying to discredit the Foundation." Alexander felt his heart sink. "What kind of group? What have you heard?" Marcus sighed. "It's not clear yet, but it seems to be a coalition of corporate interests, people who don't like the idea of empowered communities standing up to big business. They're digging into your past, Alex, and your father's and Robert's." The implications were clear. Their family's complicated history, the struggles with Victoria, Robert's past mistakes, could all be weaponized against them. "What do you suggest we do?" Alexander asked, his mind racing. "For now, stay the course," Marcus advised, "but be prepared. If they're going to come after you, it'll likely be through the media. We need to get ahead of this." After hanging up, Alexander sat in silence for a long moment, weighing their options. Finally, he picked up the phone again, dialing a familiar number. "Dad, we need to talk. I think it's time we tell our story, the whole story." The next day, the Thornton men, Richard, Alexander, and Robert, sat down for a lengthy interview with a respected journalist. They spoke candidly about their family's journey, from the dark days of Victoria's influence to their current mission of community restoration. "We're not perfect," Alexander said towards the end of the interview. "We've made mistakes, individually and as a family. But those mistakes have taught us valuable lessons, lessons that inform every aspect of our work with the Foundation." As the interview wrapped up, the journalist looked at them thoughtfully. "You're taking a big risk by being so open," she said. "Are you sure this is the right move?" Richard nodded, his expression resolute. "Transparency and honesty are core values of the Thornton Foundation. We can't ask communities to trust us if we're not willing to be vulnerable ourselves." In the days that followed, as the interview made waves across various media platforms, Alexander found himself overwhelmed by the response. There was criticism, yes, but also an outpouring of support from unexpected quarters. Former employees of Victoria's companies came forward, sharing their own stories and voicing support for the Foundation's mission. Community leaders from cities across the country reached out, eager to bring the Thornton model to their own neighborhoods. One evening, as Alexander sat in his office reviewing the latest flood of messages, he received a video call from his father. "How are you holding up, son?" Richard asked, concern evident in his voice. Alexander managed a tired smile. "It's been intense, but I think we made the right choice, being open about our past. It's actually strengthened our position." Richard nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, Alex, I've been thinking, this whole experience is not just about expanding the Foundation, it's about redefining what the Thornton legacy really means." As they talked, Alexander felt a renewed sense of purpose washing over him. They had taken a risk by exposing their vulnerabilities, but in doing so, they had also revealed their greatest strength, their commitment to growth, redemption, and positive change. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold more challenges. But as Alexander looked out his office window at the Chicago skyline, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The Thornton Foundation was no longer just a family endeavor. It was becoming a movement, fueled by the very communities it sought to serve. The true measure of their success would not be in buildings restored or programs launched, but in lives transformed and communities empowered. And that, Alexander realized, was a legacy truly worth building. The autumn wind whipped around Alexander as he stood on the rooftop of the newly completed Chicago Community Center. Below him, a crowd had gathered for the grand opening ceremony. Faces both familiar and new looked up at him expectantly. As he prepared to address the crowd, Alexander couldn't help but reflect on the whirlwind of the past few months. Their candid interview had indeed changed the narrative, but not entirely in ways they had anticipated. "Welcome, everyone," Alexander began, his voice carried by the microphone to the attentive audience. "Today marks not just the opening of a building, but the beginning of a new chapter for this community." As he spoke about the center's programs and the collaborative effort that had brought it to life, Alexander noticed a group of protesters at the edge of the crowd. Their signs accused the Thornton Foundation of being a front for corporate interests, a painful irony given their family's history. Undeterred, Alexander continued, "We stand here not as saviors, but as partners. This center belongs to you, the community. Its success will be measured not by our standards, but by the positive change you create within these walls and beyond." The speech was met with applause, but as Alexander made his way through the crowd afterwards, he could feel the undercurrent of tension. Some embraced him warmly, sharing stories of how the Foundation's programs had already impacted their lives. Others regarded him with suspicion, their trust yet to be earned. Later that evening, as Alexander sat in his hotel room reviewing the day's events, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from Uncle Robert. "Alex, have you seen the news?" Robert's voice was tense. Alexander quickly pulled up a news site on his laptop, his heart sinking as he read the headline, "Thornton Foundation accused of tax evasion and misuse of funds." "This is ridiculous," Alexander muttered, scanning the article. "These accusations are completely baseless." Robert sighed heavily. "I know, but the damage is already being done. Our partners in Atlanta are getting nervous. Some are talking about pulling out." As they discussed damage control strategies, Alexander felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. They had anticipated pushback, but the speed and ferocity of these attacks were overwhelming. The next few days were a blur of emergency meetings, press conferences, and late-night strategy sessions. The Thornton Foundation released all of their financial records, inviting independent auditors to verify their legitimacy. Alexander gave interview after interview, tirelessly refuting the false accusations. Through it all, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to these attacks than met the eye. The coordination and timing seemed too perfect to be coincidental. It was Marcus who finally connected the dots. "Alex, I think I've found the source of our troubles," he said during one of their now daily check-ins. "Remember those corporate interests I warned you about? Well, it turns out they're connected to some of Victoria's old associates." The revelation hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. Even now, years later, the specter of Victoria's influence lingered, threatening to undermine everything they had worked so hard to build. As the pressure mounted, Alexander found himself returning to Oakwood Manor, seeking the counsel and comfort of his father. He found Richard in the library poring over old family documents. "Dad," Alexander said, sinking into a chair, the weight of their challenges evident in his voice, "I'm starting to wonder if we've bitten off more than we can chew. Maybe we should have stayed focused on just Oakwood Manor." Richard looked up, studying his son's face for a long moment before speaking. "Alex, do you remember what Ezra wrote in his letter about using our resources for the greater good?" Alexander nodded, recalling the words that had set them on this path. "Well," Richard continued, "I've been doing some digging and I found something interesting." He slid an old leather-bound journal across the desk. This was Ezra's personal diary. Listen to this entry. Richard began to read aloud. Today, I faced the greatest test of my convictions. Powerful men have threatened to destroy everything I've built if I continue my efforts to improve working conditions in the factories. The easy path would be to yield, to protect what I have. But I am reminded that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in the positive change we create in the world. I choose the difficult path, for it is the right one. Alexander sat in stunned silence as the weight of Ezra's words sank in. Their great-grandfather had faced similar challenges, had grappled with the same doubts. You see, son, Richard said gently, what we're doing now, it's not new. It's a continuation of a legacy far older than Victoria's schemes. Ezra understood that doing the right thing often comes at a cost, but he also knew that the cost of not acting was far greater. Inspired by Ezra's words and his father's unwavering support, Alexander felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that their current struggles were not just a test of their resolve, but an opportunity to reaffirm their commitment to their mission. Over the next few weeks, the Thornton Foundation launched a bold new initiative. Instead of merely defending themselves against accusations, they went on the offensive, not against their accusers, but against the systemic issues that allowed corporate interests to wield such power over communities. They partnered with investigative journalists to expose the networks of influence that sought to undermine community empowerment. They launched educational campaigns to help people understand complex financial and legal systems. And most importantly, they doubled down on their grassroots efforts, working even more closely with local leaders to ensure that their programs truly reflected the needs and values of each community. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Communities that had been hesitant began to embrace the Foundation's work. Other organizations, inspired by the Thorntons' transparency and resilience, reached out to form alliances. One crisp morning, as Alexander stood on the porch of Oakwood Manor, watching the community gardens come to life with volunteers, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The path they had chosen was indeed difficult, fraught with challenges they could never have anticipated, but it was also profoundly rewarding. He thought of Ezra, of the courage it must have taken to stand up to the powerful interests of his time. He thought of his father, who had weathered Victoria's manipulation and emerged stronger, more compassionate. He thought of Uncle Robert, who had found redemption through service. The Thornton legacy, Alexander realized, was not defined by the challenges they faced, but by how they chose to face them. It was a legacy of resilience, of unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when, especially when, it was difficult. As he turned to go back inside, ready to face whatever new challenges the day might bring, Alexander felt a deep sense of peace. They were on the right path, continuing a journey that had begun generations ago. And though the road ahead might be long and fraught with obstacles, he knew that together they had the strength to see it through. The true impact of their work was just beginning to unfold, rippling out from Oakwood Manor to touch lives across the nation. And in that unfolding, the Thornton family was writing a new chapter in their legacy, one of hope, empowerment, and lasting change. The conference room at Oakwood Manor buzzed with energy as Alexander, Richard, and Robert gathered with their core team for their annual strategy meeting. The past year had been a roller coaster of challenges and triumphs, and now it was time to chart the course for the future. First of all, Alexander began, standing at the head of the table, I want to thank everyone for their incredible work during the recent crisis. Your dedication and resilience are the reason we're still standing and thriving. Nods and smiles rippled around the room. The team had indeed pulled together remarkably in the face of adversity. Richard spoke up next, his voice carrying the wisdom of experience. Now that we've weathered that storm, it's time to look ahead. We need to ask ourselves, how can we build on what we've learned? How can we expand our impact even further? As the discussion unfolded, it became clear that the recent challenges had not only tested their resolve, but had also opened up new opportunities. The transparency they had shown during the crisis had earned them a level of trust and credibility that was rare in the non-profit world. I've been fielding calls from organizations across the country, said Maria, their outreach coordinator. They want to know how we navigated the crisis, how we maintain our integrity while scaling up operations. Robert leaned forward, excitement gleaming in his eyes. What if we formalize that knowledge sharing? We could create a training program for other non-profits, teaching them our methods for community engagement and ethical operations. The idea took hold, sparking a flurry of suggestions and refinements. By the end of the meeting, a new initiative had taken shape: the Thornton Institute for Ethical Community Development. As the team dispersed, energized by the new direction, Alexander found himself alone with his father and uncle. "You know," Richard said, a hint of wonder in his voice, "when we started this journey, I never imagined we'd come this far. We're not just helping communities anymore, we're changing the way people think about community development." Alexander nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "It's amazing, isn't it? But I can't help thinking about all the work that's still left to do." Robert clapped a hand on his nephew's shoulder. "That's the Thornton spirit, Alex. Always looking ahead, always striving to do more." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity as the Thornton Institute took shape. They brought in experts from various fields, urban planning, social work, ethical business practices, to develop a comprehensive curriculum. The first cohort of participants, leaders from non-profits across the country, arrived at Oakwood Manor for an intensive 6-week program. One evening, as Alexander was walking the grounds with a group of participants, he overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. "You know, before I came here, I was seriously considering shutting down our organization," one woman was saying. "The challenges seemed insurmountable, but now I feel like we have a real shot at making a difference." Her words hit Alexander like a bolt of lightning. This was the true power of what they were building, not just the direct impact of their programs, but the ripple effect as others were inspired and empowered to create change in their own communities. As the Thornton Institute gained recognition, Alexander found himself increasingly in the public eye. He was invited to speak at conferences, to testify before congressional committees on community development issues. It was a far cry from the corporate boardrooms he had once inhabited, but he found this work infinitely more fulfilling. One particularly memorable day saw Alexander addressing a United Nations panel on sustainable urban development. As he spoke about the Thornton model of community-driven change, he couldn't help but think of how far they had come from the days when Oakwood Manor was just a neglected estate, threatened by Victoria's schemes. "The key," Alexander told the assembled dignitaries, "is to recognize that true sustainable development isn't something that can be imposed from the outside. It has to come from within the community itself. Our role is not to dictate solutions, but to provide resources, knowledge, and support to help communities realize their own visions for the future." The speech was met with enthusiastic applause, and in the days that followed, inquiries poured in from countries around the world, all eager to learn more about the Thornton approach. Back at Oakwood Manor, Richard watched these developments with a mixture of pride and amazement. One evening, as he and Alexander sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the community gardens, he turned to his son with tears in his eyes. "You've taken what we started here," Richard said softly, "and turned it into something greater than I ever could have imagined. Your great-grandfather Ezra would be so proud." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. Without our whole family. This is the Thornton legacy, all of us working together to make a difference." As they sat in companionable silence, Alexander's mind wandered to the future. The Thornton Foundation was now a recognized leader in ethical community development, their model being adopted and adapted in cities and towns across the globe. But with that success came new challenges and responsibilities. How could they ensure that their approach remained true to its roots as it spread? How could they continue to innovate and adapt to meet the ever-changing needs of communities? And perhaps most importantly, how could they prepare the next generation to carry this work forward? These questions swirled in Alexander's mind, not as burdens, but as exciting possibilities. The journey that had begun with a fight to save Oakwood Manor had evolved into a mission that was changing lives around the world. And yet, in many ways, it felt like they were still just getting started. As the last rays of sunlight faded, casting long shadows across the grounds of Oakwood Manor, Alexander felt a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. The path ahead was not clear or easy, but it was filled with potential. And as long as they stayed true to their values, integrity, compassion, and a commitment to empowering others, he knew that the Thornton legacy would continue to grow and evolve in ways they could scarcely imagine. The ripples of change that had started here at Oakwood Manor were now waves reaching shores far beyond what they had ever dreamed possible. And with each life touched, each community transformed, the true meaning of the Thornton legacy was being written anew.